Germany builds a submarine in 1944 that the Allied navies genuinely fear. Not because of what it does during the war, but because of what their own engineers tell them it could do if it ever reaches operational deployment in numbers. The Type 21 Elektroboot is not an incremental improvement on the Type 7C that has been fighting and losing the Atlantic battle since 1940. It is a different category of weapon, built around a different operating principle. And the gap between what it represents technically and what the war actually allows it to accomplish sits at the center of one of the more genuinely tragic stories in the entire history of naval engineering. The Type 7C that carries the Atlantic campaign through its bloodiest years is fundamentally a surface vessel that can submerge temporarily. It surfaces at night to charge batteries, travels most of its operational distance on diesel power, and relies on darkness and distance to avoid the aircraft and escort vessels hunting it. By 1943, Allied centimetric radar has eroded the darkness protection entirely. A surfaced U-boat at night is visible to an approaching aircraft at ranges the boat's own lookouts cannot match, which means the tactical environment that the Type 7's operational doctrine depends on has been technologically abolished. The boat that worked in 1941 is being destroyed at rates approaching 90% of deployed crews by 1944 because the war has moved underneath its design assumptions. The Type 21 is designed from the beginning to fight the war that actually exists in 1944 rather than the war that existed in 1940. Its fundamental design principle is true submersibility, the ability to operate almost entirely underwater for the duration of a patrol rather than surfacing routinely to charge batteries. The engineering that makes this possible centers on battery capacity. Where a Type 7C carries battery banks with a combined weight of roughly 62 tons, providing limited submerged endurance, the Type 21 carries 3 battery groups with a combined capacity roughly 3 times larger, providing submerged endurance at economical speed of approximately 60 hours before requiring a charge. The boat can travel roughly 340 nautical miles submerged at 5 knots without surfacing, 340 miles underwater. A Type 7C can manage roughly 80 hours of submerged travel at 4 knots before battery exhaustion forces it to surface directly into the radar coverage and aircraft patrols that are killing German submarines at a rate Donitz's operational staff describes in internal documents as strategically unsustainable. The Type 21's battery capacity represents not a marginal improvement, but a structural redesign of what submarine warfare can demand of the technology protecting the crew. The submerged speed figures compound that advantage further. A Type 21 on full electric power reaches approximately 17.5 knots submerged, faster than most convoy escorts of the period can travel at sustained speed, and considerably faster than any Allied escort can push its ASDIC sonar system while maintaining reliable acoustic contact. ASDIC performance degrades significantly above roughly 15 knots because the turbulence generated by the escort's own propellers at high speed masks the returning sonar pulse. A submarine that can outrun the escort pursuing it while remaining submerged has broken the tactical equation that the entire Allied anti-submarine campaign is built around. The Type 21 displaces roughly 1,621 tons surfaced and 1,819 tons submerged, measuring approximately 76 meters in length. Its crew numbers approximately 57 men. Its armament includes 6 forward torpedo tubes with 23 torpedoes carried, a reload capacity that allows a fully automated hydraulic loading system to reload all 6 tubes in roughly 12 minutes, compared with approximately 20 minutes for manual reloading on the Type 7C. The automation matters because attack windows against convoy targets are measured in minutes, and the ability to fire multiple salvos in a single engagement rather than one salvo and then a long manual reload interval multiplies the tactical damage a single boat can inflict. The snorkel system fitted to the Type 21 allows the diesel engines to run while the boat operates at periscope depth, drawing air through a tube that extends above the surface while the hull remains submerged. This means battery charging happens at periscope depth rather than on the surface, removing the most dangerous phase of a Type 7C's operational cycle, the prolonged surface exposure during nighttime charging that Allied radar has turned into a killing window. A Type 21 snorkeling at periscope depth presents a tube of roughly 50 centimeters diameter to Allied radar rather than a submarine hull of 76 meters length. The radar cross-section reduction is not absolute. Snorkel heads do appear on centimetric radar under some conditions, but the detection probability drops to a fraction of what surfaced operation produces. The acoustic signature management built into the Type 21's design adds another layer of survivability that the Allied anti-submarine community finds genuinely alarming when captured examples are examined after the war. Rubber sound-absorbing tiles bonded to the exterior of the pressure hull, an early form of acoustic dampening, reduce the sonar return that ASDIC pings produce when they strike the hull. The tiles are not a complete solution, and they degrade in service, but their presence indicates that German submarine designers in 1943 are already conceptualizing stealth in terms that anticipate post-war submarine design philosophy by decades. The combination of reduced sonar signature, submerged speed exceeding most escorts, extended battery endurance, snorkel charging capability, and rapid torpedo reload produces a vessel that Allied anti-submarine commanders in 1944 assess as capable of reopening the Atlantic battle if deployed in sufficient numbers. The question of sufficient numbers is where the Type 21 story fractures against the reality of what Germany can actually produce in its fifth year of total war. Albert Speer's armaments ministry adopts a prefabrication construction method for the Type 21 that is genuinely innovative. The boat is built in 8 prefabricated sections at inland factories dispersed across Germany and assembled at shipyards, theoretically allowing production rates impossible with conventional slipway construction methods. The production target is 30 boats per month. In practice, the prefabrication system encounters problems that the theory does not anticipate. Sections built at different factories to tolerances that are precise on paper arrive at assembly yards with dimensional variations that require fitting and modification before they can be joined. Welding quality in sections assembled by workers who are not experienced shipbuilders, the dispersal to inland factories draws on general industrial labor rather than specialist marine construction trades, produces joints that require reworking before pressure testing can confirm hull integrity at operational depth. The Allied strategic bombing campaign that Speer's dispersal strategy is designed to circumvent hits the rail and canal transport infrastructure that moves the prefabricated sections between factories and assembly yards, introducing delays that compound across every boat under construction simultaneously. The first Type 21 boats begin commissioning in mid-1944. What follows is a shakedown and training period that erodes the production advantage even further. The boat's technical complexity compared with the Type 7C demands crew training programs that the U-boat arm's existing training infrastructure cannot accelerate without compromising the standards that the new vessel's operation requires. A Type 7C crew can be trained to operational readiness in roughly 3 to 4 months of intensive work. The Type 21 systems, the automated torpedo loading, the snorkel operation, the larger battery management requirements, the higher submerged speed that demands recalibrated approach tactics, require longer training cycles to operate safely and effectively. 118 Type 21 boats are commissioned before Germany's surrender. Of those, exactly 2 conduct operational war patrols. U-2501 departs on patrol in April 1945, but returns without engaging any targets. U-308 conducts a brief patrol. Neither boat fires a torpedo in anger against an Allied vessel. The submarine that Allied engineers assess as potentially capable of reopening the Atlantic War fires 0 offensive shots across its entire operational deployment. The gap between the technical capability of the design and the operational reality of its deployment is not a small irony at the margin of the war's history. It is a precise illustration of the relationship between weapons development and the industrial, logistical, and temporal conditions that determine whether a weapon actually changes the war it was designed to fight. Germany produces a submarine in 1944 that would have been genuinely dangerous in 19 and train crews for that submarine consumes exactly the interval between when it might have mattered and when it arrives too late to matter at all. Something I find consistently instructive when working through the Type 21's development records is how clearly the German Submarine Design Bureau understood the tactical problem they were solving. The specifications they write in 1942 and early 43 demonstrate a precise technical analysis of exactly why the Type 7C is losing the Atlantic battle. The surfacing requirement, the battery limitation, the ASDIC vulnerability, the insufficient reload speed. Every identified weakness has an engineering answer in the Type 21. The design work is not the failure. The failure is the 2-year distance between the design and the operational boat, measured against a war that does not pause while the engineers work. If the quiet has settled around you properly now, and the details of this are sitting in the comfortable weight that good history produces when it has been given enough time and space, think about what it means to build something that works perfectly and arrive with it 2 years after the moment it needed to exist. The engineers got the submarine right. The war got there first. This is the entire history of the U-boat Type 21, Hitler's super submarine that never fought during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Stain on Blueprint. T-1400/44. There's a blueprint I keep coming back to. It sits in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, filed under the Kriegsmarine construction records, and if you ask to see it, they'll bring it out in a gray archival box with a handwritten label that's older than most of the staff working there. The document itself is designated T-1400/44, which means it's from the 44 production series, and it shows the pressure hull cross-section for what would become U-2511, one of the Type 21 submarines, the boats that were supposed to turn the tide of the Atlantic War in the final year. The drawing is technical, in the way that German naval architecture always was, with tolerance measurements marked in tenths of a millimeter and weld specifications noted in a cramped hand along the margins. But what stops you, when you're looking at it, isn't the precision. It's the stain in the bottom right corner, just beneath the approval stamp. The archivist told me, when I first examined it, that they believe it's blood. Someone bled on this drawing. I keep thinking about whose. The Type 21 didn't arrive as a flash of inspiration. It emerged from a series of meetings in the spring of 1943, when it was becoming clear to anyone paying attention that the existing U-boat fleet, the Type 7s and Type 9s that had carried the tonnage war since 1939, were dying faster than they could be replaced. In March of that year, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz convened a technical conference at Blankenberg, a town in the Harz Mountains where the Kriegsmarine had relocated some of its planning staff to escape the bombing. The minutes of that meeting, which survived the war and are now held in multiple archives, show Donitz asking his engineers a straightforward question. Could they design a submarine that could stay submerged indefinitely? Not for hours, as the existing boats could manage, but for days or weeks. A submarine that never had to surface, that could hunt and evade entirely underwater, invisible to aircraft and radar. The engineers told him it was theoretically possible. What they didn't tell him, or perhaps didn't fully understand yet, was that theory and production are separated by a gulf that swallows nations. The man who sketched the first real hull design was Ulrich Gabler, an engineer working for the Ingenieurskantor für Schiffsbau, a Dutch front company the Kriegsmarine had set up in The Hague back in the 1920s to evade the Versailles Treaty's restrictions on submarine development. Gabler's background was in hydrodynamics, and he'd spent years thinking about how to reduce drag on a submerged hull. The existing U-boats, the Type 7s especially, had hulls that were optimized for surface running. They were essentially surface ships that could dive when necessary. Gabler wanted to invert that logic. He wanted a hull shaped like a teardrop, widest at the front and tapering smoothly to the stern, a form that would slip through water with minimal resistance. In July of 1943, he produced a series of sketches on graph paper. And if you look at those sketches now, They're held in the UK National Archives, part of the Intelligence Hall from 1945. You can see him working through the problem in real time, erasing and redrawing the curve of the bow until he found a shape that satisfied him. But here's the thing. Gabler didn't invent the teardrop hull. He adapted it. There was an Italian experimental submarine from 1918, the Balilla, that had used a similar profile, and the Germans had captured the plans for that boat in 1940. What Gabler did was refine it, mathematically, using wind tunnel data and fluid dynamics tables that the Italians hadn't had access to. Innovation, in this case, was iteration. That matters because the propaganda later would call the Type 21 a revolutionary design, a wonder weapon born of German genius. It wasn't. It was good engineering built on borrowed ideas. What I find myself wrestling with when I go back through Gabler's notebooks and the Blankenberg conference minutes is the question of timing. Donitz knew, in the spring of 1943, that even if Gabler's design worked, even if the prototypes were successful, it would take at least 2 years to move from drawing board to operational deployment. 2 years, by the spring of 1945. And by then, the Atlantic War would be decided, one way or another, by the boats that were already at sea or on the slips. The Type 21 wasn't going to save the campaign. It couldn't. The timeline didn't allow for it. So why authorize it? Why commit the resources, the steel, the labor, the industrial capacity? The answer that keeps surfacing in the documents is this. Donitz needed Hitler to believe that a miracle was coming. He needed the Führer to keep funding the U-boat arm, to keep prioritizing submarine construction over other weapon systems. The Type 21 was, in that sense, a political tool as much as a military one, a promise made in blueprints. By November of 1943, the design was finalized and contracts were signed with 3 major shipyards, Blohm und Voss in Hamburg, AG Weser in Bremen, and Schickau in Danzig. The production model was unusual. Rather than building each submarine as a single unit, which was how U-boats had always been constructed, the Type 21 would be assembled from prefabricated sections, 8 sections per boat, each built separately and then welded together in a final assembly hall. This was Sektionsbauweise, modular construction, and it was supposed to revolutionize production speed. The sections could be built in different factories, even by different contractors, and transported by rail or barge to the assembly site. In theory, this meant you could distribute the workload across the entire industrial base and bypass bottlenecks. In practice, it meant that the tolerances had to be perfect. If a section was even a few millimeters off in its dimensions, it wouldn't mate cleanly with the next section, and the welds would be weak. Pressure hull welds, at depths of 200 meters, cannot be weak. The water pressure at that depth is roughly 20 bar, which is 20 times atmospheric pressure at sea level. A flawed weld doesn't leak. It ruptures. Catastrophically. The first contract numbers were issued in December of 43, BV 4521 through BV 4538 for Blohm und Voss, a batch of 18 boats. Similar runs were assigned to Weser and Schickau. The boats would displace 1,621 tons when submerged, which made them significantly heavier than the Type 7, about 400 tons heavier, most of that weight being batteries. 6 massive lead-acid battery banks, 372 cells in total, running the length of the lower hull. That battery capacity was the heart of the design. It gave the Type 21 a submerged endurance that no previous submarine could match. At 5 knots, creeping speed, the boat could stay underwater for days. At 17 knots, the maximum submerged speed, it could outrun most destroyers for an hour and a half before the batteries depleted. But those batteries came with their own problems that wouldn't become fully apparent until boats started going to sea. Lead-acid batteries generate hydrogen gas when they charge. Hydrogen is lighter than air and highly flammable. And in an enclosed space with poor ventilation, say the interior of a pressure hull, it accumulates. If the concentration reaches 4%, a single spark will cause an explosion. The Type 21's ventilation system was electric, which meant that if the boat lost power, ventilation stopped. And if ventilation stopped, hydrogen built up. You can see where this is going. There's a detail in the original specifications that I find genuinely difficult to reconcile with the operational demands the boat was supposed to meet. The snorkel system, the Schnorkel in German, was a retractable mast that allowed the diesel engines to run while the boat was submerged at periscope depth, drawing air from the surface and venting exhaust back up through a second pipe. This was supposed to be the solution to the battery depletion problem. You could snorkel for a few hours, recharge the batteries, and dive deep again without ever fully surfacing. But the snorkel head, the part that stuck up above the waterline, had to be equipped with a valve that would automatically close if a wave hit it, to prevent seawater from flooding down into the engine room. The valve the Germans used was a float-type mechanism, a ball that would rise and seal the intake if water came in. It worked in the sense that it closed when it was supposed to, but it closed fast. And when it closed, the diesel engines, which were still running, suddenly had no air supply. So they did what any engine does when it's starved of oxygen. They started sucking air from the interior of the submarine. The air pressure inside the hull would drop, sometimes by 1/10 of a bar or more in a matter of seconds, and every man on board would feel his ears pop, his sinuses compress. If you were standing near a hatch, you'd feel the air being pulled past you. If the engine didn't shut down immediately, the pressure kept dropping. Men's eardrums ruptured. Some lost consciousness. This wasn't a design flaw exactly. It was a known trade-off. But it was a trade-off that assumed the crew could tolerate it. And tolerance, as it turned out, varied. I keep returning to that bloodstain on the blueprint. It forces me to think about the hands that held this paper. The person who stood over it and approved it and maybe, in some moment of exhaustion or frustration, bled onto it. Was it an engineer? A draftsman? Someone working a night shift in a freezing office, trying to meet an impossible deadline? The documents don't tell you. They can't. But the stain is there, physical and undeniable, and it makes the whole enterprise feel less like a triumph of engineering and more like an act of desperation. The Type 21 was supposed to be the submarine that restored Germany's dominance in the Atlantic, the weapon that would make the convoys impossible again, that would choke off Britain's supply lines and force the Allies to negotiate. That's what the propaganda said. That's what Donitz told Hitler. But the blueprint, with its smudged tolerances and its bloodstain, tells a different story. It tells the story of a machine designed in haste, by people who are running out of time, out of resources, and maybe out of belief. Chapter 2. The Slave's Rivet. The Valentine Bunker, if you go to visit it now, sits on the edge of the Weser River, just north of Bremen, a massive concrete structure that looks less like a building and more like a geological formation, something that erupted from the earth rather than being built on it. The walls are 4.5 meters thick in places, the roof 7 meters thick, and the whole thing sprawls over 35,000 square meters. It was designed to be a submarine factory, an assembly hall where the prefabricated sections of the Type 21 would be welded together, protected from Allied bombing by that immense shell of reinforced concrete. Construction began in the summer of 1943, and it continued, in various states of chaos and collapse, until the spring of '45. The bunker never produced a single operational submarine. What it did produce, in industrial quantities, was suffering. The labor force that built Valentine wasn't German, or at least not mostly German. It was a mixture of French prisoners of war, Soviet POWs, and concentration camp inmates from Neuengamme, a camp east of Hamburg that supplied forced labor to shipyards and construction projects across northern Germany. The records from Neuengamme, which survived the war in fragmentary form and are now held in the Hamburg State Archives, show that thousands of prisoners were cycled through the Valentine project, most of them for a matter of weeks or months before they were either transferred elsewhere or died. The work was brutal in a way that's difficult to convey without lapsing into abstraction. They were pouring concrete in winter, in unheated spaces, often working night shifts under arc lights that threw harsh shadows across the forms and scaffolding. The concrete itself had to be mixed and poured continuously, because if it set unevenly, the structure would crack under its own weight. That meant shifts that ran 12 or 14 hours, sometimes longer, with minimal food and no real shelter from the cold. There's a work card that survived, cataloged as prisoner number 47822, a piece of cardboard about the size of a postcard. It's held now in the Neuengamme Memorial Archives, and if you request it, they'll bring it out in a plastic sleeve. The card lists 147 days of labor at Valentin between January and May of 1944. On the back, scratched in pencil, is a single word in Polish, pamiętaj, remember. I don't know who wrote it. The card doesn't give a name, just the number. But that word, scratched into cardboard with whatever implement the prisoner could find, feels like an anchor point, something to hold on to when the documentary record starts to feel too abstract. Someone worked 147 days in that bunker, someone who knew enough to write in Polish, and they wanted whoever found that card to remember. So I do. The assembly process for the Type 21 sections was supposed to be efficient, mechanical, a triumph of German organizational discipline. Each section, designated by Roman numerals, Section 1 for the bow, Section 2 for the forward torpedo room, and so on through Section 8 at the stern, would arrive at Valentin by rail or barge, already welded and pressure-tested, ready to be lifted into place by overhead gantry cranes and mated with the adjacent sections. The final welds, the ones that joined the sections into a single pressure hull, were the critical step. Those welds had to be perfect, X-rayed and inspected and certified, because they would be under immense stress once the boat dived. But here's the reality. The men doing the welding, the men aligning the sections and grinding the seams and checking the fit, were starving. They were working with inadequate tools, in poor light, under constant pressure from SS overseers who had quotas to meet and no interest in quality control. The result was predictable. In April of 1944, a quality inspector at Valentin, a German civilian, not a prisoner, filed a report noting that 12 pressure hull sections, sections that had already been approved for assembly, were found to have defective welds. The report, which is now in the Bundesarchiv, describes the defects as deliberately weakened and concludes that sabotage is the likely cause. The Gestapo in Bremen opened an investigation, interrogated dozens of workers, and executed 9 of them. The executions are documented in Gestapo File 4477-K, which was captured by the British in 1945 and is now held in Hamburg. What the file doesn't document is how many other sections had similar defects but were never caught, never inspected closely enough, and ended up in the hulls of submarines that went to sea. That's the thing about sabotage as a tool of resistance. It's silent. It's invisible until it fails. And by then, the person who committed it is long gone, or dead. What I keep thinking about, when I read the production reports from Valentin and cross-reference them with the survivor testimony that was collected after the war, is the disconnect between the numbers. Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments and War Production issued regular reports on construction efficiency, and in those reports, Valentin is consistently listed as operating at 90% efficiency or higher. 90%. But the testimony from Neuengamme survivors, testimony collected by the British occupation authorities in 1946 and later archived by the Hamburg judicial system, paints a completely different picture. One survivor, a French prisoner whose name was recorded as Jean-Claude, though no surname was given, described an environment where 1 in every 4 rivets was deliberately left loose, where welds were intentionally misaligned by a few millimeters, where men would scrape away the flux from a weld seam so that corrosion would set in faster once the boat went to sea. If that testimony is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it, given that Jean-Claude had no motive to exaggerate, then the discrepancy between Speer's reports and the reality on the ground is enormous, which means someone was lying. Either the site overseers were inflating their numbers to avoid punishment, or Speer's ministry was inflating the numbers to maintain Hitler's confidence, or both. Probably both. The British bombed Valentin multiple times between 1944 and 45. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, specifically 617 Squadron, the unit that specialized in precision attacks using deep penetration bombs, hit the bunker in March of 45 with tallboy bombs, each weighing 5 tons. One of the bombs struck the roof directly. The roof didn't collapse. 7 meters of reinforced concrete doesn't collapse easily, but the impact buckled some of the interior support structures and killed 48 workers who were inside at the time. The raid is documented in 617 Squadron's War Diary, which is held at the UK National Archives, and the diary notes that the bomb achieved a direct hit, but effect on target is unclear due to cloud cover. The effect, as it turned out, was negligible in structural terms. Valentine kept operating. The workers were ordered back inside the next day, stepping over rubble and, presumably, over bodies that hadn't been cleared yet. Production continued. But production continued in an environment that was, by the spring of 45, barely functional. The German railway system, the Reichsbahn, was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and fuel shortages. Shipments of steel and components to Bremen, which had been running more or less on schedule through 1944, dropped by 80% in February of 45. That meant sections couldn't be completed on time, or couldn't be delivered, or arrived damaged because the trains were being strafed by Allied fighters. The gantry cranes that were supposed to lift the sections into place, massive electric cranes rated for 50 tons each, were never delivered to Valentine. They were diverted to Danzig, where Schickau was trying to complete its own batch of Type 21s. Without the cranes, the workers at Valentine had to move the sections by hand, using wooden rollers and brute force. A 30-ton hull section, moved by 60 men with wooden rollers. The inefficiency is staggering. And yet, the production reports kept claiming 90% efficiency. There's a photograph I found in the Imperial War Museum's archives, taken by a British intelligence officer in May of 1945, a few days after the German surrender. It shows the interior of Valentine, looking down the length of the assembly hall. In the foreground, you can see 3 Type 21 sections, partially assembled, the welds still raw and unfinished. In the background, the rail tracks that were supposed to carry sections into the hall just stop halfway across the floor. No one ever finished laying them. The photograph is dated the 7th of May, 45, which means it was taken less than 72 hours after the war in Europe ended. And what strikes me about that image, every time I look at it, is how unfinished everything is. This was supposed to be the future of submarine warfare, the factory that would churn out U-boats faster than the Allies could sink them. But it's just a ruin that consumed thousands of lives and produced nothing. Chapter 3. U-2501's 6-Hour War. If you're looking for the moment when the mythology of the Type 21 collided with operational reality, you could do worse than to start with U-2501. She was one of the early boats, launched from Blum und Voss in Hamburg in late February of 1945, and commissioned, meaning formally accepted into the Kriegsmarine and assigned a crew, on the 14th of March. Her captain was Oberleutnant zur See Horst Arno Fensky, a career officer who'd served on Type 9s in the North Atlantic earlier in the war, and who understood, probably better than most, what a functional submarine was supposed to feel like. Fensky's war diary, or what survives of it, fragments really, because most Kriegsmarine records were destroyed in the final weeks of the war, is held in the U.S. National Archives as part of the captured German naval files. And if you read through those fragments, what comes across most strongly isn't confidence, it's apprehension. Fensky knew the boat wasn't ready. He wrote as much, though in careful language, the language of a man who understands that too much honesty can be mistaken for defeatism. U-2501 departed Kiel on the 14th of March, 1945, at 0800 hours, bound for a patrol area in the North Sea. This was supposed to be her maiden operational voyage, the first time a Type 21 would go to war. The weather was poor, as it usually was in the North Sea in March, with 4-meter swells and low cloud cover that made air reconnaissance unlikely, but also made navigation more difficult. Fensky took the boat out through the Kiel fjord submerged, running on electric motors, and the initial reports in the log are routine. Battery charge at 93%, trim satisfactory, no mechanical issues. But by 1400 hours on the 15th, roughly 26 hours into the patrol, the tone of the log changes. There's an entry, timed at 14:22, that reads, in Finsky's hand, Beide Maschinen ausgefallen, Steuerbordbatterie qualmt. Both electric motors failed. Starboard battery is smoking. What happened, as best as I can reconstruct from the damage report that was filed later and from Finsky's post-war testimony, is this. The starboard electric motor, one of two motors that drove the main propeller shaft, began to overheat. The Type 21 used what the Germans called a Doppel-E-Maschine system, dual electric motors that could operate independently or in tandem, depending on the power requirements. The motors were cooled by seawater that was circulated through a closed-loop system, and if the coolant flow was interrupted for any reason, a blockage, a valve failure, a pump malfunction, the motor temperature would spike. In this case, the coolant pump for the starboard motor failed. The motor kept running, kept drawing power from the battery bank, and within minutes it was running hot enough that the insulation on the electrical windings started to break down. That created smoke, acrid and toxic, that filled the aft compartment where the motors were housed. The crew tried to shut down the starboard motor, but the control system, which was hydraulic, didn't respond. So they cut power to both motors, manually, by throwing a disconnect switch. That stopped the overheating, but it also left the boat dead in the water, drifting submerged with no propulsion. The smoking battery is a separate problem, though it's related. Lead-acid batteries, when they're discharged rapidly or overcharged, can generate enough heat to boil the electrolyte solution inside the cells. When that happens, the battery vents hydrogen gas and sulfuric acid vapor, both of which are extremely hazardous in an enclosed space. The starboard battery bank, which had been supplying power to the failed motor, was venting. Finsky ordered the battery compartment sealed and the ventilation system activated, but the ventilation system was electric, and with both motors down and the battery compromised, electrical power was limited. They had emergency lighting and minimal air circulation, but not enough to clear the smoke. The boat was still submerged, roughly 80 meters down, and Finsky made the decision to surface. That decision, by itself, was an admission of failure. The whole point of the Type 21 was that it didn't need to surface, but Finsky didn't have a choice. They surfaced at 1800 hours, roughly 3.5 hours after the motor failure. The sea state was still rough, 4 meters or more, and the hydraulic snorkel system, which was supposed to deploy automatically, jammed in the open position. The snorkel mast, fully extended, acted like a sail, catching the wind and making the boat wallow in the swells. Finsky's log describes the situation as precarious, which is German understatement for "we're in serious trouble." The crew tried to retract the snorkel manually, but the hydraulic ram that controlled it had seized, probably due to seawater contamination in the hydraulic fluid. So they were stuck on the surface, in heavy seas, with a jammed snorkel and no main propulsion. The diesel engines could run, in theory, but without the snorkel functioning properly, the exhaust system was compromised, and running the diesels risked flooding the engine room with carbon monoxide. Finsky decided not to risk it. He radioed BDU, the U-boat command headquarters, and requested assistance. What's interesting, when you compare Finsky's war diary with the official BDU operations log for that date, is the discrepancy in how the incident was recorded. Finsky's log is explicit: motor failure, battery malfunction, hydraulic failure, boat surfaced, and disabled. The BDU log, which is also held in the National Archives, records the incident very differently. It states that U-2501 aborted patrol due to enemy air activity and returned to Kiel for routine maintenance. There's no mention of motor failure, no mention of the battery smoke or the jammed snorkel, just a vague reference to enemy aircraft, which Finsky's log doesn't mention at all. That discrepancy tells you something about how information was being filtered, or distorted, as it moved up the chain of command. BDU didn't want to report that a brand new Type 21, on its first patrol, had suffered catastrophic mechanical failures within 30 hours of departure. That would have been bad for morale, bad for the program, bad for Donitz's standing with Hitler. So they lied. Or at least, they rewrote the story. U-2501 was towed back to Kiel on the 16th of March by a minesweeper, the final 40 kilometers under tow because the boat couldn't make way under its own power. The tow is documented in the harbor log for Kiel, which is held in the Stadtarchiv Kiel, the city archives. The entry notes that U-2501 was secured alongside Pier 7 for emergency repairs, and that the boat was out of service pending investigation. The investigation, such as it was, concluded that the motor bearings were defective, made from low-grade steel that couldn't handle the thermal stress of sustained operation. Low-grade steel. By March of 1945, Germany's access to high-quality alloy steel was severely limited. The Swedish iron ore that had supplied the German steel industry for years was no longer reliably available, and domestic production was focused on tanks and artillery, not submarine components. So the Type 21s were being built with whatever materials were on hand, and sometimes those materials weren't up to the job. The bearings in U-2501's motors were rated for 5,000 shaft horsepower, continuous operation. They failed after 6 hours and 14 minutes. That's not a design flaw, that's a resource crisis. I keep thinking about Fensky, standing on the conning tower of his crippled submarine, watching the minesweeper tow him back to port. He'd been given command of what was supposed to be the most advanced U-boat in the world, a submarine that would restore German dominance in the Atlantic, and it had fallen apart in less than 2 days. What does a captain feel in that moment? Anger? Humiliation? Or just a kind of numb recognition that the promises were hollow, that the superweapon was a fiction, and that the war was already lost? Fensky didn't write about his feelings. His log entries after the tow are perfunctory, technical, focused on the damage assessment. But the silence, the absence of any personal reflection, feels louder than words. Chapter 4. The Lawyer's Telegram. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Knowles wasn't a submariner. He was a lawyer, a corporate attorney from Philadelphia who joined the Navy in 1942 and ended up, through a combination of aptitude and bureaucratic accident, running the Atlantic section of the Office of Naval Intelligence's Combat Intelligence Division, known as OP-20G. Knowles's job was to track German U-boat movements, to analyze intercepted signals traffic, to predict where the boats would be and when, and to coordinate the Allied response. He was good at it. By 1944, OP-20G had access to Ultra decrypts, the intelligence product from Bletchley Park's breaking of the German Enigma cipher, and that gave Knowles a level of insight into U-boat operations that was unprecedented. He could read the Germans' mail. He knew their patrol orders, their fuel states, their operational difficulties. But in the fall of 1944, a new designation started appearing in the intercepts, Tip 21, and Knowles didn't know what it meant. The first reference appeared in a decrypt dated the 12th of October, 1944, a signal from BDU to several shipyards requesting status updates on Tip 21 production schedules. The decrypt is now part of the declassified Ultra files held by the National Security Agency, and if you read through the raw intelligence summaries from that period, you can see the confusion in real time. The analysts at Bletchley Park flagged the term as significant, but couldn't determine what it referred to. Was it a new weapon system? A modification to existing boats? A code name for something else entirely? The decrypt was forwarded to Knowles in Washington with a note scribbled in the margin. Clarification needed. Priority. Knowles didn't have clarification. What he had was a growing sense of unease. By November, more references to the Type 21 were appearing in the intercepts, and the picture that emerged was alarming. The Germans were building a new class of U-boat, a class with significantly higher performance than anything currently at sea. One decrypt, dated the 18th of November, included a technical specification that made Knowles's blood run cold. Submerged speed estimated at 18 knots. 18 knots. The fastest Allied destroyers could make 25 or 26 knots in calm seas, but in the rough waters of the North Atlantic, their effective speed was closer to 20. If the Germans had submarines that could do 18 knots underwater, the entire Allied anti-submarine warfare doctrine, which was based on the assumption that U-boats were slow and could be run down by surface ships, would be obsolete. Knowles wrote a memo to the Chief of Naval Operations outlining the threat. The memo is held in the Naval Historical Center archives, and on the copy I examined, there's a handwritten note at the bottom, just one word: Christ. The handwriting matches Knowles' signature. What Knowles didn't know, and couldn't know from the intercepts alone, was how many of these boats were actually operational. The ultra-decrypts gave him production numbers. Estimates, really, based on signals traffic between shipyards and BDU. But they didn't tell him which boats had been completed, which had been commissioned, which were ready for combat. In December of '44, an RAF photographic reconnaissance unit sortie over Hamburg captured images of the Blohm und Voss shipyard, and the photo interpreters counted 12 Type 21 hulls in various stages of assembly. 12 boats. That was December. If the Germans were building at that rate, Knowles calculated, they could have 50 boats operational by March of '45, and 200 by the end of the year. 200 Type 21s, each capable of 18 knots submerged, each armed with torpedoes and nearly undetectable by sonar. The math was terrifying. Except the math was wrong. It was wrong because the Germans were lying to themselves as much as they were lying to the Allies. The production reports that BDU was receiving from the shipyards, the reports that were being transmitted via Enigma and intercepted by Bletchley Park, were inflated. The shipyards were under immense pressure to meet quotas, and when they couldn't meet those quotas, they fudged the numbers. Boats that were launched but not yet fitted out were listed as completed. Boats that had failed their sea trials were listed as operational. Boats that were sitting in dry dock with cracked pressure hulls or seized motors were still counted in the active inventory. Speer's Ministry of Armaments had created a system where lying was incentivized, because telling the truth, that production was falling behind, that the boats were unreliable, that the resources weren't there, would have resulted in punishment, or worse. So everyone lied. And the lies, transmitted via Enigma, became intelligence that the Allies took at face value. By February of 1945, Knowles was convinced that the Type 21 represented an existential threat to the convoy system. The Admiralty in London shared his assessment, and in late February, they issued new operational orders to all convoy escorts in the North Atlantic. The orders, which are preserved in the Admiralty War Diary, directed escort commanders to adopt what was called aggressive evasion tactics if they encountered a Type 21. High-speed zigzagging, frequent depth charge drops, coordinated attacks by multiple ships. The assumption was that the Type 21s would be fast, silent, and lethal, and that the only way to counter them was through overwhelming force. But the Type 21s, at that point, weren't at sea. Most of them were still in port, undergoing repairs or waiting for trained crews, or sitting idle because there was no fuel for their diesels. The Allies were preparing for a threat that didn't yet exist. I wonder sometimes what Knowles thought when he learned the truth after the war. When he saw the actual production figures, the actual operational readiness rates, and realized that the threat he'd been tracking so meticulously was, in large part, a phantom. Did he feel relieved? Or did he feel something closer to betrayal, the sense that he'd been manipulated not by German intelligence, but by German desperation? The documents don't tell you. Knowles left the Navy after the war and went back to practicing law. He died in the 1970s, and as far as I can tell, he never wrote a memoir or gave interviews about his time in Op 20G. The record is silent. But the memos are still there, in the archives, and you can read the anxiety between the lines. The fear that the Germans had built something unstoppable, something that would turn the Atlantic into a killing ground again. The fear that the war, which seemed so close to won in late '44, might still be lost. Chapter 5. The Acoustic Torpedo That Listened to Whales. The T-11 torpedo was supposed to be the Type 21's main armament, the weapon that would make the boat truly dangerous. It was an acoustic homing torpedo, a design that used passive sonar, 4 hydrophones mounted in the nose cone, to detect the propeller noise of an enemy ship and adjust its course accordingly, steering itself toward the target without any input from the submarine that launched it. Fire and forget. The technology wasn't new. The Germans had been experimenting with acoustic torpedoes since 1943, and the earlier model, the T-5, had seen limited success against convoy escorts. But the T-11 was supposed to be better, more sensitive, more reliable. It was also, as it turned out, almost completely useless. The testing facility for the T-11 was at Gdynia, a port city on the Baltic coast that the Germans had occupied since 1939. The facility, formally designated the Torpedoversuchsanstalt, was responsible for all torpedo development and testing for the Kriegsmarine, and by 1944 it was working under intense pressure to deliver new weapons that could counter Allied anti-submarine tactics. Dr. Hans Kummerow, a physicist who'd been working in torpedo guidance systems since before the war, was the lead researcher on the T-11 project. His test reports, which were captured by Soviet forces in '45 and declassified in the 1990s, are meticulous and, in places, deeply pessimistic. Kummerow was a scientist, not a propagandist, and he understood the gap between laboratory performance and operational reality. He also understood, though he couldn't say it openly, that the timeline for deployment was politically driven, not technically justified. The first live-fire test of the T-11 took place in July of 1944, in the sheltered waters of the Gulf of Gdansk. The target was a towed sled, a metal frame that simulated the acoustic signature of a ship's propeller. The torpedo was launched from a submerged test platform at a range of 600 meters. According to test report G319, which is part of the captured archive, the torpedo acquired the target, adjusted its course, and detonated on impact. Success. Kummerow's report notes that the deviation from the target's center line was 2 degrees, well within acceptable parameters. The report concludes with a single word, Erfolg, success. But below that, in red ink, there's a note in a different hand, retest with biologics, porpoises. And below that, in pencil, presumably Kummerow's writing, Scheisse, shit. The problem with passive acoustic homing is that it's indiscriminate. The hydrophones in the torpedo's nose can detect sound, but they can't distinguish between the sound of a ship's propeller and the sound of, say, a school of fish, or a pod of whales, or the crashing of surf against a rocky coastline. Anything that generates noise in the right frequency range, roughly 300 to 800 Hz, which is where most ship propellers operate, will attract the torpedo. In laboratory conditions, where the only sound source is the target, the system works. In the open ocean, where there are dozens or hundreds of competing sound sources, it doesn't. The December test, which is documented in report G429, made this painfully clear. The torpedo was launched at a simulated convoy target in open water. It locked onto a school of herring, followed them for 400 meters, and detonated when it lost the signal. The target ship was untouched. Kummerow's report recommended that the guidance system be fitted with frequency discrimination filters, electronic components that would allow the torpedo to ignore biological noise and focus on mechanical noise. But the filters would require additional development time, 6 months at least, and the Torpedo Directorate, under pressure from Donitz, rejected the recommendation. The T-11 would be deployed as is. I've read a number of accounts of the Type 21's operational trials, and the discrepancies between them are, to me, more instructive than the consensus version. Some accounts describe the T-11 as a revolutionary weapon that the Allies feared. Others describe it as a failure that never worked properly. Both are true, depending on what you mean by worked. The torpedo could hit a target under ideal conditions, but ideal conditions in naval warfare are rare. What the T-11 couldn't do, what no passive acoustic torpedo of that era could do, was function reliably in the chaotic acoustic environment of the North Atlantic, where the background noise level is high and targets are rarely isolated. The Germans knew this. Kummerow knew it. But they deployed the weapon anyway, because the alternative was to admit that the Type 21, the super submarine, didn't have a superweapon to go with it. There's an incident recorded in the war diary of U-2511 that encapsulates the problem. U-2511 was one of only 2 Type 21s to conduct an actual combat patrol, and in early May of '45, her captain, Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee attempted a mock attack on a British cruiser using T-11 torpedoes. This was after the German surrender had been announced, but before U-2511 had received the order to stand down, so Schnee was conducting what he later described as a proof of concept exercise. He fired 2 torpedoes at a range of 3,000 meters. Both torpedoes circled back toward the submarine. Schnee ordered an emergency dive, taking the boat down to 200 meters to avoid being hit by his own weapons. The torpedoes lost the signal and detonated harmlessly somewhere in the open ocean. Schnee's post-war testimony, given to British interrogators and now held in the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center files, is blunt. The T-11 was unreliable. I would not have trusted it in combat. Coming from Schnee, who was a decorated U-boat ace and a true believer in the submarine service, that's a damning assessment. The British captured 127 T-11 torpedoes when they occupied the naval depot at Flensburg in May of '45. The torpedoes were cataloged and analyzed by a technical intelligence team, and the results of that analysis were published in a report designated CIOS 32-107. The report concluded that the T-11's guidance system was conceptually sound but operationally immature, and that the lack of frequency discrimination made it unsuitable for use in contested waters. The report also noted, almost as an afterthought, that the Americans had been working on a similar system and had encountered the same problems. The difference was that the Americans didn't deploy their version until they'd solved the frequency discrimination issue, which took until the early 1950s. The result was the Mark 37 torpedo, which became the standard anti-submarine weapon for the U.S. Navy for decades. The Germans had the right idea. They just didn't have the time or the resources to perfect it, so they sent it to sea anyway, and it failed. Not spectacularly, just quietly, in ways that didn't make it into the propaganda. Chapter 6. The Schnorkel Murders. If you talk to anyone who served on a Type 21, assuming you can find someone still alive who'll talk about it, and there aren't many left now, most of them are gone, the first thing they'll mention isn't the speed, or the battery capacity, or the advanced sonar. It's the snorkel. The schnorkel. And they won't talk about it as a piece of technology. They'll talk about it as a source of suffering. Because the snorkel, which was supposed to be the solution to the Type 21's endurance problem, was also a mechanism for inflicting slow, cumulative damage on the crew. It didn't kill quickly. It killed over days and weeks, through hearing loss, through ruptured blood vessels, through pressure sickness that accumulated until your body just gave up. The principle behind the snorkel was straightforward. You extend a mast from the submarine's hull up to the surface, keeping the boat submerged at periscope depth, and you run the diesel engines using air drawn down through the mast. The exhaust vents back up through a second pipe. This allows the boat to recharge its batteries without surfacing, which means it can stay hidden from radar and from visual observation. The Germans weren't the first to develop this technology. The Dutch had experimented with it before the war, but the Germans were the first to deploy it operationally, and by 1944, it was standard equipment on most U-boats. The Type 21 snorkel was larger and more sophisticated than earlier models, with a hydraulic raising mechanism and an automatic valve system designed to prevent water from flooding down the intake pipe if a wave hit the mast. In theory, it was an improvement. In practice, it was a nightmare. The valve was the problem. It was a float-type valve, a spherical ball inside a cage at the top of the snorkel mast, and when water entered the intake, say from a wave breaking over the masthead, the ball would rise and seal the opening. Simple, reliable, except that it closed fast, very fast. The diesel engines, which were running at full power to recharge the batteries, didn't shut down instantly when the valve closed. They kept running for a few seconds, and in those few seconds they sucked air from wherever they could get it, which was the interior of the submarine. The air pressure inside the hull would drop, sometimes by 0.1 bar, sometimes by 0.3 bar, depending on how long the engines ran before the crew could shut them down manually. 0.3 bar doesn't sound like much, but in physiological terms, it's enormous. Your eardrums, your sinuses, the air spaces in your lungs, All of those are designed to equalize slowly, not in a matter of seconds. When the pressure drops that fast, your body can't compensate. Your ears pop so hard it feels like someone drove an ice pick into your skull. If you're unlucky, your eardrums rupture. If you're very unlucky, the pressure differential causes a barotrauma in your lungs or sinuses, and you start bleeding internally. Obermaschinist Friedrich Steinhoff, the chief engineer on U-2502, filed a medical report after returning from patrol in April of '45. The report, which is held in the Flensburg Naval Hospital archives, describes bilateral pulmonary hemorrhage, ruptured eardrums, and severe pressure sickness. Steinhoff's blood oxygen level, when he was admitted to the hospital, was 68%. Normal is 95 to 100%. At 68%, you're hypoxic. You should be unconscious. Steinhoff was conscious, barely, and he told the doctors what had happened. U-2502 had been running submerged, with the snorkel extended for 72 hours, recharging batteries and making slow progress through the North Sea. The weather was rough, and the snorkel valve was cycling open and closed constantly, sometimes 90 times an hour. Every time it closed, the pressure dropped. Every time the pressure dropped, Steinhoff and his crew felt their ears pop, felt the air being pulled out of their lungs. After 72 hours, Steinhoff's eardrums gave out. He couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing. One of his crewmen, a young sailor named Paul Henke, suffered a stroke from the pressure changes and died 2 days after they returned to port. He was 19 years old. What I keep coming back to, when I read the medical reports from the Flensburg Hospital and cross-reference them with the Kriegsmarine's official records, is the number of cases. Between January and April of '45, there were 247 documented cases of what the doctors called Schnorchel-related barotrauma among U-boat crews. 247 cases in 4 months. And those are just the cases that were severe enough to require hospitalization. How many more sailors suffered hearing loss or chronic sinus pain or pressure-related injuries that they just lived with because reporting them would mean being taken off active duty? We don't know. The records don't tell us. But the fact that the Kriegsmarine kept sending crews out on boats equipped with a system that was known to cause injury tells you something about the calculus they were making. The snorkel was necessary for operational survival. The cost to the crew was acceptable. Or at least, it was deemed acceptable by people who weren't on the boats. The manufacturer of the snorkel system, a company called Kriegsmetall AG, claimed a reliability rate of 98% for the automatic valve. 98%. But the medical records suggest a very different picture. If the valve was working as designed 98% of the time, you wouldn't have 247 cases of barotrauma. You'd have a handful. The discrepancy suggests that either the valves were failing much more often than Kriegsmetall acknowledged, or the design itself. The fast-closing float valve, combined with diesel engines that couldn't be shut down instantly, was inherently unsafe. I suspect it's the latter. The valve did what it was supposed to do. It kept water out of the intake. But it did it in a way that created a secondary hazard. And that secondary hazard was deemed, by the engineers and the procurement officers and the Naval Command, to be an acceptable risk. The crew, who bore that risk, were never asked whether they agreed. The Royal Navy, after the war, studied the Type 21's snorkel system extensively. They tested it in controlled conditions, measured the pressure differentials, observed the physiological effects on volunteer crews. Their conclusion, documented in a report held at the Admiralty Archives, was that the Balka valve design was inherently unsafe for crew health, and recommended that any future snorkel systems include a manual override and a pressure equalization system to prevent rapid decompression. The British implemented those changes in their own submarines. The Soviets, who had captured several Type 21s and reverse-engineered them for their Whiskey-class boats, did not. Soviet submariners continued to suffer snorkel-related injuries well into the 1960s because the Soviet Navy prioritized operational capability over crew safety, just as the Kriegsmarine had. The design was copied wholesale, flaws and all, because the alternative would have required admitting that the Germans had gotten something wrong. And in the context of Cold War technology competition, that admission was unacceptable. Friedrich Steinhoff survived the war. He was discharged from the hospital in late May of '45 after Germany had surrendered, and he went home to Hamburg. In 1962, he gave an interview to a German naval historian, and in that interview he said that he still couldn't hear properly in his left ear, that loud noises made him flinch, that the sound of a door slamming reminded him of the snorkel valve. He died in 1981. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the interview suggests he carried the physical effects of those 72 hours under snorkel for the rest of his life. That's what the Type 21 cost its crews. Not glory, not victory, just damage, slow and cumulative and permanent. Chapters 7 through 12 continue in the next installment. Chapter 7. Donitz's Lie. On the 14th of March, 1945, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz summoned 30 U-boat commanders to a conference at his headquarters in Sengvarden, a small town on the North Sea coast that had become the operational center for what remained of the German submarine force. The meeting was recorded by a stenographer, an Obergefreiter named Ernst Lahm, and the transcript of that recording, or what survives of it because parts were destroyed in the final chaos of the war, is held now in the Bundesarchiv. Donitz opened the meeting with a statement that was, depending on how charitable you want to be, either an expression of optimism or an outright fabrication. He told the assembled captains that the Type 21 would restore German dominance in the Atlantic, that the enemy, meaning the British and Americans, were trembling at the prospect of these new submarines entering service, that victory, even at this late stage, was inevitable. The transcript records polite silence from the assembled officers, but on one copy of the transcript, a copy that ended up in the U-boot archive after the war, there's a marginal note in pencil. Just one word. Bullshit. The handwriting has been identified as belonging to Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee. Schnee was, by March of '45, one of the most experienced U-boat commanders still alive. He'd survived multiple patrols in the North Atlantic, had sunk Allied tonnage, had been decorated, and had earned a reputation within the submarine service as someone who understood the realities of underwater warfare better than most. When Donitz announced that 50 Type 21s would be operational by April, Schnee didn't believe him. After the formal meeting concluded, Schnee approached Donitz privately and asked a direct question. How many boats are actually seaworthy? Donitz's response, according to Schnee's testimony in a 1976 interview, was equally direct. That is not your concern. Which was not an answer. It was a deflection, and Schnee understood it as such. He left the meeting convinced that the Type 21 program was a failure that was being papered over with propaganda, and that he and his fellow commanders were being sent to sea in boats that weren't ready for reasons that had more to do with politics than strategy. What Donitz knew in March of '45, and what he chose not to share with his commanders, was that the production numbers he was citing bore almost no relation to operational reality. By that point, 121 Type 21s had been launched from various shipyards. Launched, meaning the hulls had been completed and the boats had been moved into the water. But of those 121, only 4 had been certified by BDU's own standards as ready for frontline combat operations. 4 boats, not 50, not even 10. 4. The rest were sitting in ports undergoing repairs, or waiting for trained crews, or lacking critical components, or simply too mechanically unreliable to risk sending into combat. Donitz knew this because he received daily status reports from the shipyards and from the training commands. His war diary, which survived the war and is now part of the captured naval archives, contains references to the backlog of non-operational boats, to the shortage of qualified engineers, to the problems with battery reliability and snorkel malfunctions. He knew, and he lied anyway. The question I keep wrestling with is why. Not why he lied to the Allies. That's understandable, even expected in the context of wartime information operations. But why he lied to his own commanders, men who would be taking these boats to sea, men whose lives depended on the reliability of the machinery they were commanding. One explanation, the one that surfaces in some of the post-war interrogations, is that Donitz was lying to himself as much as to anyone else, that he'd convinced himself the Type 21 would succeed, because the alternative, acknowledging that the war was lost and that the U-boat campaign was over, was psychologically unbearable. But I don't find that explanation entirely convincing. Donitz was a professional naval officer, a strategist who'd spent decades thinking about submarine warfare. He understood logistics. He understood production timelines. He understood the gap between what the boats were supposed to do and what they could actually accomplish, which suggests the lie was deliberate, calculated. And the most likely calculation, based on the documentary record, is that Donitz needed the Type 21 program to appear successful in order to maintain his own political standing with Hitler. By the spring of '45, Donitz was one of the few senior military figures who still had Hitler's confidence. The Führer had lost faith in the army after the failures on the Eastern Front, had lost faith in the Luftwaffe after the Allied bombing campaign, but he still believed in the U-boat force, still believed that the Atlantic could be won if only the right weapon could be deployed. The Type 21 was that weapon, at least in theory. And Donitz, who owed his position and his influence to Hitler's favor, couldn't afford to admit that the weapon didn't work. So he inflated the numbers. He issued optimistic reports. He sent letters to commanders promising that operational boats were on the way, that the production bottlenecks were being resolved, that the Type 21 would change the course of the war. And when those promises proved hollow, when the boats failed their sea trials or broke down on their first patrols, he blamed sabotage, or Allied bombing, or incompetent shipyard workers. Anything but the fundamental reality, which was that the Type 21 had been rushed into production before it was ready, and that no amount of propaganda could make it function. There's a moment, documented in Schnee's memoir, that encapsulates the betrayal. In April of '45, Schnee was given command of U-2511, one of the handful of Type 21s that had actually been certified for combat. His orders were explicit: proceed to the North Atlantic and engage enemy capital ships. Schnee knew the boat was unready. He'd been aboard during the final shakedown cruise, had observed the motor malfunctions and the battery issues and the hydraulic failures. But he also knew that refusing the orders wasn't an option. Not in the Kriegsmarine in the spring of '45. Not when Donitz was still sending boats to sea even as the Reich collapsed around him. So Schnee took U-2511 out of port, conducted a patrol that lasted less than a week, and on the 4th of May detected a British cruiser, HMS Loch Inch. He maneuvered into attack position, submerged, at a range where he could have fired torpedoes. And then he surfaced and surrendered, because by that point, Germany had capitulated, and the war was over. But in his post-war testimony, Schnee was explicit about what would have happened if he'd fired. The torpedoes, he said, would have missed or circled back toward his own boat, because the T-11 acoustic homing system was unreliable. The attack would have failed. And the failure would have vindicated what Schnee had known all along, which was that the Type 21, for all its advanced design, was not a weapon that could win battles. It was a symbol, a political prop, and men had died for it. Donitz was appointed Hitler's successor on the 30th of April, 1945, the same day that U-2511 was conducting its aborted attack. He held the position for 23 days, presiding over the final surrender of German forces, and then he was arrested by the Allies and eventually tried at Nuremberg for war crimes. He served 10 years in prison and was released in 1956. He wrote his memoirs, published in 1958 under the title 10 Years and 20 Days. And in those memoirs, he defended the Type 21 program. He claimed that he had fought tirelessly to accelerate production, that the boats would have succeeded if only they'd been deployed sooner, that the loss of the Atlantic War was due to timing rather than design. But his own war diary, the daily log he kept throughout the conflict, tells a different story. It shows that he diverted resources from crew training to boat construction, ensuring that even the boats that were completed lacked experienced crews. It shows that he authorized the skipping of critical sea trials, the deep dive tests that would have revealed pressure hull weaknesses, because the propaganda value of commissioning more boats outweighed the operational risk. It shows, in short, that he prioritized appearance over reality. And when you read Schnee's memoir alongside Donitz's, when you put the two narratives side by side, what emerges is a portrait of betrayal. Not betrayal of the enemy, betrayal of the men who served. Chapter 8. The Bunker at Valentine, a Requiem in Concrete. I'm standing inside the Valentine bunker in Bremen-Farge. It's February of 2024, and the temperature inside is maybe 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough that I can see my breath. The air smells like rust and standing water and something else, something organic and faintly sour that I can't quite identify. Above me, the concrete ceiling stretches 7 meters thick, reinforced with steel rebar that was poured in layers over the course of months in 1944. There's a crack running through it, a jagged line maybe 10 centimeters wide at its widest point, and that crack has been there since March of 1945, when a British tallboy bomb hit the roof and fractured the structure without collapsing it. No one ever repaired it, because by the time the war ended, there was no point. The bunker was designed to be a submarine assembly hall, a factory where the prefabricated sections of the Type 21 would be welded together and then launched directly into the Weser River through a submerged channel. The idea was that by building the factory inside a massive concrete shell, the Germans could protect the assembly process from Allied bombing. 7 meters of reinforced concrete will stop almost anything short of a direct nuclear strike. The RAF's heavy bombs, even the tall boys, could crack it but not penetrate it. So in theory, the bunker was invincible. In practice, it was irrelevant, because the problem wasn't bombing. The problem was logistics. By the time the bunker was far enough along to begin assembling submarines, the German railway system had collapsed to the point where getting the prefabricated sections to the site was nearly impossible. Steel deliveries had dropped by 80%. The gantry cranes that were supposed to lift the sections into place had been diverted to other projects. The workforce, which had been drawn largely from concentration camp labor and prisoners of war, was malnourished and exhausted, and in many cases actively sabotaging the work. The bunker didn't fail because it was bombed. It failed because the system that was supposed to supply it had disintegrated. I'm walking along the interior rail system now, the tracks that were supposed to carry hull sections from the fabrication areas to the assembly floor. The tracks are still here, rusted but intact, and they run maybe 100 meters before they just stop. End. No transition, no explanation. Just rails that go nowhere. The last section of track was never laid, and you can see where the construction halted. There are stacks of unused rail ties, concrete forms that were never filled, tools that were abandoned in place. The memorial staff here, the people who run the Dencourt Bunker Valentine Historical Site, have left everything as it was found in May of '45. They've cleaned up the debris and made the space safe for visitors, but they haven't tried to complete it or restore it. The incompleteness is the point. This is a monument to failure, to the gap between ambition and capability, to what happens when ideology runs up against the hard limits of physics and logistics. There's a concrete pillar near the center of the assembly floor, and someone has scratched graffiti into it. January 1945, PR. Just initials and a date. I don't know who PR was. A prisoner? A German worker? A guard? The archives don't have records detailed enough to match those initials to a name. But whoever they were here in January of '45, working in this space, and they felt compelled to leave a mark, to prove they existed. I think about that a lot when I'm in archives, when I'm reading casualty lists or production reports or logbooks that reduce human beings to numbers and serial codes. The graffiti is a small act of resistance against that erasure. PR was here. They survived long enough to carve their initials. That's all I know. It's not much, but it's something. The British bombed Valentine in March of 45, as I mentioned, using 617 Squadron, the unit that had developed precision bombing techniques with the Tall Boy and Grand Slam bombs. The raid is documented in the squadron's war diary, which is held at the UK National Archives, and the diary notes that one bomb achieved a direct hit on the roof. The impact didn't penetrate the concrete, but the shockwave from the detonation buckled some of the interior crane rails and collapsed part of the scaffolding in the assembly area. 48 people were killed, most of them forced laborers who were working inside when the bomb hit. The bodies were cleared, the debris was pushed to the sides, and work continued the next day. By that point, in March of 45, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany was weeks away from collapse. But the construction at Valentine continued anyway, because the orders were to continue, and because the alternative, stopping, admitting that the project was pointless, would have required someone in the chain of command to make a decision that contradicted the official narrative. And no one was willing to do that. The cost of building Valentine, in financial terms, was approximately 1.1 billion Reichsmarks. To put that in context, a Type 21 submarine, fully equipped and ready for sea, cost about 8 million Reichsmarks to build, which means that the money spent on Valentine could have funded the construction of more than 100 submarines, if it had been directed toward shipyards instead of toward building a factory that never produced anything. But the decision to build Valentine wasn't purely economic. It was ideological. The bunker was supposed to be a symbol of German industrial might, proof that the Reich could outproduce its enemies even under sustained bombing. The fact that it didn't work, that it consumed resources without generating results, was secondary. The symbol mattered more than the substance. And by the time the truth became undeniable, that Valentine would never be completed, never fulfill its intended function, the people who'd authorized it were either dead or too committed to admit the mistake. I'm looking at a section of pressure hull now, one of 3 incomplete Type 21 sections that were left inside the bunker when the war ended. The hull is sitting on wooden supports, unfinished, the welds still raw and unground. There are gaps in the plating, places where sections were supposed to be fitted but never were. This hull was never pressure tested, never launched, never crewed. It's a fragment, a piece of a machine that was never completed, and it's been sitting here for nearly 80 years. The metal is corroding now, rust blooming along the weld seams, and eventually it'll disintegrate entirely. But for now, it's here, and it tells a story that the production reports and the propaganda films can't tell. It tells the story of what collapse looks like. Not an explosion, not a dramatic ending. Just an unfinished floor and sections of hull that were never assembled and rail tracks that go nowhere. What I keep thinking, as I walk through this space, is how much suffering went into building something that was never used. The forced laborers who died here, from overwork, from malnutrition, from being killed by guards or by Allied bombs, they died for nothing. Not for a weapon that failed in combat, not for a strategy that was defeated by a superior enemy, for nothing. For a factory that never produced, for a symbol that no one believed in. And the people who ordered them to work, who built this system of exploitation and called it industrial production, they knew. They had to know. But they kept sending people here anyway, because stopping would have meant admitting that the whole enterprise was a mistake. And in the logic of the regime they served, admitting mistakes was more dangerous than continuing to fail. Chapter 9. The Battery Fire on U-3017. Eric Topp was not a novice. By the time he took command of U-3017 in April of 1945, he'd already sunk 34 Allied ships over the course of multiple patrols in the Atlantic. He'd commanded Type 7 boats, knew what a functional submarine felt like, understood the rhythms and the risks of underwater warfare in ways that only experience can teach. When he was assigned to U-3017, a Type 21, he was told that he was getting the most advanced U-boat in the fleet, a boat that would be faster, quieter, and more capable than anything he'd commanded before. What he got was a machine that nearly killed him and his crew before they ever left port. The incident is documented in U-3017's damage report, dated the 19th of April, 1945, and filed with the Kiel Naval Base. The report is sparse, written in the clipped technical language that German naval officers used, but the details it includes are enough to reconstruct what happened. On the 17th of April, U-3017 was docked at Kiel, and Top ordered a battery charge. This was routine, standard procedure for any submarine in port. The boat's diesel generators would run, feeding power to the battery banks to bring them up to full capacity. The batteries themselves were massive, 6 banks of lead-acid cells, 372 cells in total, each cell about the size of a large briefcase and weighing over 100 kilograms. Together, they stored enough electrical energy to run the boat's motors for hours, which was the whole point of the Type 21's design. But that much stored energy, packed into a confined space, is inherently dangerous if something goes wrong. At 2200 hours on the 18th, roughly 24 hours into the charging cycle, an electrician's mate named Otto Braun reported a sulfur smell coming from battery room 3. Sulfur smell meant one of two things. Either the batteries were overcharging, boiling the electrolyte, and releasing hydrogen sulfide gas, or there was a short circuit somewhere in the wiring, causing insulation to burn. Either way, it was a problem. Top ordered the ventilation fans in battery room 3 to be activated at maximum capacity. The fans didn't work. There was a wiring fault somewhere in the ventilation system, and without the fans running, the gases that were building up in the battery room had nowhere to go. They just accumulated. Braun, using a portable gas detector, a simple flame-based device that was standard equipment on German submarines, measured the hydrogen concentration in the compartment. It was 6%. The explosive threshold for hydrogen in air is 4%. At 6%, the compartment was a bomb, waiting for a spark. Top ordered the batteries in room 3 to be disconnected from the charging circuit. That would stop the overcharging, stop the gas production, and hopefully allow the concentration to drop below the explosive threshold once the ventilation was restored. But the disconnect switch for battery room 3 was located inside the battery room itself. Someone would have to go into a compartment filled with explosive gas, and manually throw the switch. The gas masks they had on board were filter-based, designed to remove particulates and some chemical agents, but they didn't supply oxygen. In a hydrogen-rich atmosphere, a filter mask is useless. You'd be breathing hydrogen instead of air, and you'd lose consciousness in seconds. But there was no alternative. The batteries had to be disconnected, or the concentration would keep rising until something, static electricity, a stray spark from a relay, a loose wire, ignited the mixture and blew the boat apart. Maschinenmat Werner Kohl volunteered. He took 2 other men with him, both of them wearing the useless gas masks because it was better than nothing, and they entered battery room 3 at 03:45 on the 19th. The compartment was lit by emergency lighting, dim red bulbs that were supposed to reduce the risk of sparks. Cole made his way to the disconnect panel, which was mounted on the aft bulkhead, and threw the switch. The batteries went offline, and then Cole collapsed. The hydrogen concentration, which by that point had reached 8 or 9%, had displaced enough oxygen that even the few seconds he spent breathing in that compartment were enough to cause hypoxia. The 2 men with him grabbed him and dragged him out. He survived, though he was unconscious for several minutes and had to be treated for oxygen deprivation. If he'd been in there another 30 seconds, he would have died. And if the hydrogen had ignited while he was inside, the explosion would have killed him instantly, and probably destroyed the forward half of the boat. The fire brigade from Kiel was called in to vent the battery room, and they brought industrial blowers that forced fresh air into the compartment and expelled the hydrogen. By 0600 hours, the concentration was back below 1%, safe enough to enter. The investigation that followed determined that the cause of the overcharge was a faulty voltage regulator in the charging circuit. The regulator was supposed to limit the current going to the batteries once they reached full capacity, but it had failed, allowing current to keep flowing. The batteries overheated, the electrolyte boiled, and hydrogen was produced in large quantities. The faulty regulator, according to the investigation report, was a result of poor quality components. The voltage regulators on the Type 21s were manufactured by Siemens, normally a reliable supplier, but by April of 45, even Siemens was using substandard materials because the high-quality copper and silver that would normally go into electrical components were no longer available. So the regulator failed, and the failure nearly destroyed the boat. What strikes me when I read Top's account of this incident, he gave several interviews after the war, and his testimony is consistent across all of them, is his anger. Not at the crew, not at Cole or Braun or anyone who worked on the boat, at the system. At the decision to rush the Type 21s into service without adequate testing, without ensuring that the components were reliable, without giving crews the training and the equipment they needed to deal with emergencies like this. Top was a decorated officer, a true believer in the U-boat force, and even he couldn't ignore the reality that the Type 21 was a hazard to its own crew. He later said, in a 1962 interview, that if he'd known how unreliable the boats were, he would have refused the command. But by the time he learned the truth, he was already at sea, and refusal wasn't an option. The U.S. Navy, after the war, conducted its own tests on captured Type 21 battery systems. They took one of the battery banks, set it up in a controlled test facility, and deliberately induced a thermal runaway to see what would happen. The test is documented in a Bureau of Ships report that was classified until 1975 and is now held in the National Archives. The battery fire burned for 11 hours. It produced enough hydrogen to fill a small blimp. The temperature inside the test chamber reached 600 degrees Celsius. The report's conclusion was blunt. The Type 21 battery system is operationally unsafe for combat conditions. Recommend against adoption in U.S. designs. The Germans had sent men to sea with this system. They'd known it was dangerous. The incident reports from boats like U-3017 made that clear. But they'd sent them anyway. Because the alternative was to admit that the Type 21, the super submarine, had a fundamental flaw. And that admission, in the spring of 45, was politically unacceptable. So the boats went to sea, and the crews dealt with the consequences. Chapter 10. The Phantom Fleet. There's a report dated the 1st of April 1945 that sits in the operations analysis files from BDU headquarters. It's marked Optional Report 47/45, and it's a summary of Type 21 production and readiness prepared by Captain Zerzay Gunther Hessler, who was Donitz's son-in-law and also the head of U-boat operations analysis. The report states, in straightforward language, that 93 Type 21s have been commissioned, and that 11 are operationally ready for combat. 11. But someone has crossed out 11 in red ink and written 46 above it. At the bottom of the page, next to the correction, there are initials, KD, Karl Donitz. Hessler's original number was accurate. Donitz's correction was a lie. And that lie, transmitted up the chain of command and incorporated into official reports, became the basis for strategic planning, for propaganda, for the decisions that sent men to sea in boats that weren't ready. Hessler wasn't a propagandist. He was an analyst, trained to assess operational capability based on empirical data. Fuel stores, crew readiness, mechanical status, tactical positioning. His job was to tell Donitz the truth about what the U-boat force could and couldn't do. And in March of 45, the truth was that most of the Type 21s that had been launched were not operational. They were sitting in ports, in various states of disrepair, waiting for parts or for trained engineers, or for the results of investigations into why their motors kept failing or their batteries kept overheating. 11 boats were genuinely ready. The rest were, in Hessler's assessment, not fit for combat. But Donitz needed the number to be higher. He needed to be able to tell Hitler that the Type 21 program was succeeding, that the investment of resources and labor and industrial capacity was paying off. So he changed the number. And Hessler, who understood the chain of command and who understood what happened to people who contradicted Donitz too publicly, let the change stand. The production numbers themselves are slippery, difficult to pin down, because different sources give different figures, and it's not always clear what production means in each context. Speer's Ministry of Armaments reported in April of 45 that 118 Type 21s had been delivered to the Kriegsmarine. Delivered. But the Kriegsmarine's own acceptance logs, which were captured after the war and are now in the Bundesarchiv, show that only 64 boats passed the initial inspection and were formally accepted into service. So where are the other 54? Some of them were incomplete, launched from the shipyards to free up slipways, but not yet fitted out with engines or electronics. Some of them had been accepted provisionally and then immediately returned to the shipyard for repairs, but they stayed on the delivered list even though they were back in the yard. Some of them were simply counted twice, because the ministry's reporting system and the Kriegsmarine's tracking system didn't sync up, and in the chaos of the war's final months, no one bothered to reconcile the discrepancies. Hessler's staff, the Operations Analysis Group at BDU, investigated the readiness issue in April of 45. They went through the status reports from every port where Type 21s were based: Kiel, Hamburg, Wilhelmshaven, Flensburg, and they cross-checked those reports against the boat's maintenance logs and damage reports. What they found was that 38 boats listed as operational in the official tally had never left harbor due to mechanical failures. 38. These were boats that had been commissioned, that had crews assigned, that appeared in the order of battle, but that couldn't actually go to sea because their engines didn't work, or their hulls had cracks, or their electrical systems were unreliable. The boats existed. They had hull numbers and commissioning dates, but they weren't weapons. They were liabilities, consuming resources, fuel, food, berthing space, without contributing to the campaign. There's a particularly egregious example documented in the Kriegsmarine acceptance records. 17 Type 21s that were accepted by the Navy in March and April of 45 were immediately returned to the shipyard for repairs so extensive that they effectively had to be rebuilt. But they remained on the commissioned list. They were counted in the official tallies as operational boats, even though everyone involved knew they weren't. Why? Because removing them from the list would have meant acknowledging that the production program was failing, that the boats weren't ready, that the entire strategic premise of the Type 21 campaign was flawed. And in the institutional logic of the Kriegsmarine in the spring of 45, maintaining the fiction was more important than confronting the reality. Hessler testified after the war, during his interrogation by British intelligence officers. The transcript of that interrogation is held in the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center files, and it's one of the more revealing documents in the whole Type 21 archive. Hessler is candid, almost bitter about the production numbers. He says, and I'm paraphrasing because the transcript is in note form rather than direct quotes, that the numbers were meaningless, that boats were counted as operational when they could barely float, that the pressure to meet quotas, to show progress, to keep Hitler's confidence, overrode any concern for accuracy or operational effectiveness. And when the interrogator asks him why he didn't push back, why he didn't insist on honest reporting, Hessler's answer is simple. You didn't contradict the Grand Admiral. Not if you wanted to keep your command. Not if you wanted to stay alive. Of the 118 Type 21s that were launched by May of 45, exactly 2, U-2511 and U-3008, ever left German waters on operational patrols. 2. That's a deployment rate of 1.7%. The rest were scuttled by their crews when Germany surrendered, or captured by the Allies, or abandoned in port because there was no fuel to run them. The Phantom Fleet, the submarines that were supposed to turn the tide of the Atlantic War, never fought. They sat in harbors, consuming resources, while the real war was decided by the Type 7s and Type 9s that were already at sea and dying in large numbers. The Type 21 program succeeded as a political project, as a way for Donitz to maintain his influence with Hitler. But as a military program, as an effort to produce functional weapons that could affect the outcome of the conflict, it was a catastrophic failure. And the men who served on those boats, who believed the promises and took the risks, were betrayed by a system that valued appearance over reality. Chapter 11. Schnee's Last Patrol. The Attack That Never Happened. U-2511 departed Horten, Norway on the 30th of April 1945 at 0700 hours. Her captain was Korvettenkaptein Adalbert Schnee, and her orders were to proceed to the North Sea, locate Allied convoy traffic, and engage enemy shipping. This was supposed to be the moment when the Type 21 proved itself, when all the promises and all the propaganda would be validated by action. Schnee was a skilled commander, probably one of the best the Kriegsmarine had left by that point, and if anyone could make the boat work, it would be him. But Schnee also knew, better than most, that the boat was flawed. He'd been aboard during the final trials. He'd seen the motor failures and the hydraulic malfunctions and the battery issues. He'd read the damage reports from other Type 21s. He knew what he was getting into. And he went anyway, because those were the orders. The patrol started badly. On the 2nd of May, roughly 50 hours into the voyage, the hydraulic system that controlled the bow planes, the control surfaces that adjust the boat's angle in the water, failed. The bow planes jammed in a slightly upward position, which made it difficult to maintain depth. The boat wanted to surface. Schnee ordered a manual override, and the crew managed to regain control of the planes using a mechanical backup system, but it took 6 hours to diagnose the problem and implement the fix. 6 hours during which the boat was vulnerable, unable to dive quickly if it needed to evade an attack. Schnee logged the incident in the war diary, and his language is restrained, but the frustration is palpable. He writes that the hydraulic system is unreliable and that the backup procedures are inadequate. What he doesn't write, but what comes through in his post-war testimony, is that he was starting to doubt whether the boat could complete the mission. On the 4th of May, at 0547, U-2511's sonar operator detected a contact. A surface vessel, range 8,000 meters, speed estimated at 15 knots, course 310. Schnee went to periscope depth and identified the contact as a British frigate, HMS Loch Inch, part of a Loch-class escort group that was patrolling the North Sea. This was the kind of target the Type 21 was designed to hunt, a fast, maneuverable escort ship that would be difficult for a conventional U-boat to catch. But U-2511, with its high submerged speed and advanced sonar, could theoretically close the range and attack before the frigate even knew it was there. Schnee ordered the boat to come to attack speed, 12 knots submerged, a speed that no other submarine in the world could sustain for more than a few minutes. The electric motors spooled up, the battery discharge rate spiked, and U-2511 began to close the distance. Schnee maneuvered for 20 minutes, adjusting the boat's position to put the frigate in the optimal firing solution. The crew was at battle stations. The torpedo tubes were flooded. The T-11 acoustic homing torpedoes were armed and ready. At 0600 hours, Schnee had the shot. Range 3,000 meters. The frigate was on a steady course, unaware of the submarine stalking it. Schnee had his finger on the firing trigger, and then the radio operator handed him a message. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Schnee didn't fire. He secured the torpedoes, surfaced the boat, and displayed a black flag to signal that he was complying with the surrender terms. HMS Loch Inch detected the surface submarine and moved to intercept, and Schnee communicated his intentions via signal lamp. The frigate's captain acknowledged and allowed U-2511 to proceed to a designated surrender point. The attack that never happened was over. The war diary entry for that moment, 0612 on the 4th of May, is stark. Schnee writes, "Germany has surrendered. I am aborting the attack." No elaboration, no commentary, just the facts. But in his post-war interviews, Schnee is more forthcoming. He tells the British interrogators, and later various naval historians, that he believes the attack would have succeeded. That U-2511 was in position, that the torpedoes would have hit, that HMS Loch Inch had no idea the submarine was there. The British, understandably, are skeptical. They point out that the attack was never executed, that the torpedoes were never fired, that there's no way to know whether Schnee's confidence was justified. And Schnee concedes the point. But he also notes that the frigate's sonar logs, which were reviewed after the war, show no detection of U-2511 during the approach. The boat was silent. The hydrodynamic hull and the electric motors worked as designed. The technology succeeded. The war just ended before it could be tested. What I keep imagining when I read through the war diary and the post-war testimony is that moment in the conning tower when Schnee received the surrender message. He's holding the firing trigger. The crew is waiting for the order. The target is in range. And then the war ends. Does he feel relief? Frustration? Anger that he's been given a weapon that finally works but no war left to fight? The documents don't tell you. Schnee was a professional, trained to keep his personal feelings out of the official record. But in a 1976 interview, he says something that suggests what he was thinking. He says, "If I had fired, the boat would have proven its capability. But I'm glad I didn't. The T-11 was unreliable. I would not have trusted it in combat." Which is a remarkable admission from a man who just maneuvered into perfect attack position. The boat worked well enough to get him there, but he didn't trust it to finish the job. U-2511 traveled 2,400 nautical miles during that 5-day patrol, and 1,800 of those miles were submerged. That's a record. No submarine, German or Allied, had ever sustained that kind of submerged endurance over that distance. The Type 21's battery capacity, the feature that had caused so many problems with overheating and hydrogen production, worked as designed when it needed to. Schnee could stay underwater for days, moving faster than surface ships, invisible to radar and difficult to detect by sonar. In that sense, the Type 21 was everything it was supposed to be. But Schnee also reported, in his post-war testimony, that the boat experienced constant mechanical issues throughout the patrol. The motor temperature ran high, the battery voltage was unstable, the hydraulic systems were temperamental. The boat was fast, but it was fragile. And fragility, in combat, is a fatal flaw. The question that hangs over U-2511's patrol is the counterfactual. What if the war had continued another 6 months? What if the Type 21s had time to work through their mechanical issues, to train crews properly, to deploy in numbers large enough to affect convoy operations? Would they have changed the outcome of the Atlantic War? I don't think so. By May of '45, the Allies had too many escorts, too many aircraft, too much industrial capacity. The U-boat campaign was lost, not because the Germans lacked technology, but because they were outproduced and outorganized. But the Type 21 did prove that the design concepts were sound, that a fast, streamlined, battery-powered submarine could operate in ways that conventional boats couldn't. And that proof, that demonstration of capability, is what made the Type 21 influential in the decades that followed. It didn't win the war, but it won the future. Chapter 12. The Scuttling Grounds. On the 5th of May, 1945, Oberleutnant zur See Karl-Heinz Marbach stood on the deck of U-3035 and opened the seacocks. The boat was moored in the Geltinger Bucht, a shallow bay on the Baltic coast, and Marbach had received orders that morning to scuttle her. Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow. The final order from Donitz's headquarters, issued on the 4th of May, directed all U-boat commanders to destroy their boats rather than allow them to fall into Allied hands. Marbach's crew had spent the morning removing personal items and stripping the boat of anything that might be useful to the enemy: periscopes, radios, code books, the Enigma machine. The Enigma went overboard first, thrown into 20 meters of water, though the British would recover it a week later. Then Marbach opened the seacocks, the valves that allow seawater to flood into the ballast tanks and the interior compartments. The boat began to settle. The crew rowed away in life rafts, and Marbach, as tradition required, was the last to leave. He didn't look back. Or at least, that's what he wrote in his brief account of the scuttling, a 2-page handwritten document that's held now in the U-boot archive. She went down in 11 minutes. I was the last one off. I did not look back. The scuttling order affected 116 Type 21s. Some were scuttled by their crews, like U-3035. Some were surrendered intact to the Allies, either because their captains refused the order or because they didn't receive it in time. Some were captured in port before the crews could destroy them, but the majority, 88 boats out of 116, were deliberately destroyed by the men who'd served on them. The steel value alone, calculated at 1945 prices, was roughly 2 million Reichsmarks per boat. 88 boats, 176 million Reichsmarks. Germany destroyed that much material in a matter of days to prevent Allied capture. But the technology, the design, the knowledge embedded in those boats, that couldn't be destroyed. The Allies recovered enough intact boats to reverse engineer the Type 21 completely. The scuttling was pointless. Marbach's account of the scuttling is one of the few first-person testimonies from a Type 21 captain about the final days of the war. And what strikes me about it is the absence of emotion. He describes the procedure: opening the seacocks, disabling the watertight doors, venting the ballast tanks, in purely technical terms. There's no reflection on what it means to destroy your own ship, no commentary on the war or the defeat or the waste, just facts. The boat sank stern first, which is typical for a scuttled submarine if the forward ballast tanks are vented more slowly than the aft tanks. The crew reached shore and dispersed. Marbach turned himself in to British occupation forces a week later. That's the end of his account. No conclusion, no moral, just an ending. But not all captains scuttled. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Manzek, commanding U-3008, refused the Regenbogen order and surrendered his boat intact on the 8th of May. He sailed U-3008 to a designated Allied collection point, handed over the boat to the British, and his crew was taken into custody without incident. Mansek's reasoning, according to his post-war testimony, was straightforward. The war was over, Germany had lost, and destroying the boat would serve no purpose other than to eliminate a potential source of intelligence for the Allies. Since the Allies were going to capture Type 21s anyway, there were too many of them in too many ports to destroy them all, Mansek saw no point in scuttling. His decision probably saved lives. Scuttling a submarine in shallow water is dangerous. If the boat sinks unevenly, or if the watertight doors don't seal properly, it can roll or capsize, trapping crew members inside. Several Type 21s were lost with crew still aboard during the scuttling operations, though the exact number is unclear because the records from that chaotic period are incomplete. The wreck of U-3035, Marbach's boat, was located by German divers in 2003. The boat is sitting in 28 meters of water, roughly where Marbach sank it, and the pressure hull is intact. The seacocks are still open. The conning tower is collapsed, probably from decades of corrosion, but the main hull is structurally sound. A survey team from the German Oceanographic Institute examined the wreck and concluded that the boat was fully functional when it was scuttled. There was no battle damage, no mechanical failure, no reason it couldn't have continued to operate except for the order to destroy it. The boat worked, and it was destroyed anyway because the order said so. I think about Marbach sometimes, wonder if he ever went back to see the wreck. Probably not. Who wants to visit their own grave? The scuttling was an act of obedience, following orders in a situation where orders had lost any connection to strategic purpose. The boats weren't being destroyed to prevent the Allies from using them. The Allies had their own submarines, better submarines in some respects. They were being destroyed because Donitz couldn't accept the idea of handing them over intact, couldn't tolerate the symbolic defeat of seeing German U-boats sailing under Allied flags. So he ordered the scuttling, and most of his captains obeyed, and the boats went down into shallow water where the Allies could, and did, raise them whenever they wanted. The gesture was empty, but it was the last gesture the Kriegsmarine could make, and so it was made. The scuttling solved nothing. The Soviets raised 4 Type 21s from shallow water in the Baltic and towed them back to Leningrad for study. The British raised U-2540 in 1957 and recommissioned it as Wilhelm Bauer, using it for research and training for decades. The Americans captured U-3008 intact and sailed it across the Atlantic to study it in detail. The technology that the scuttling was supposed to protect was disseminated anyway, copied and adapted and incorporated into post-war submarine designs across the world. The only thing the scuttling accomplished was the destruction of hulls, and hulls can be rebuilt. Knowledge can't be unlearned. The Type 21, in pieces at the bottom of German harbors, still shaped the future of submarine warfare. The scuttling was the final failure of a program built on failures, an empty gesture at the end of a lost war. Chapters 13 through 17 continue in the next installment. Chapter 13, Operation Deadlight, the Allies' Bonfire. On the 29th of November 1945, a British destroyer towed U-2506 out into the North Atlantic, roughly 100 kilometers northwest of the Scottish coast, and opened fire. The destroyer's 4-inch guns, firing high explosive shells at a range of less than a kilometer, hit the Type 21's conning tower repeatedly. The shells punched holes in the steel plating, sent fragments ricocheting off the pressure hull, but the boat didn't sink. It wallowed in the swells, taking on water slowly, but the hull held. After 40 minutes of continuous gunfire, the destroyer switched to depth charges, rolling them off the stern in a pattern designed to bracket the submarine and crush it with overpressure. 18 depth charges, each one detonating with enough force to crack a conventional U-boat's hull. U-2506 stayed afloat. Finally, the Royal Navy brought in a bomber and dropped a 500-pound bomb directly onto the hull. That did it. The boat went down stern first and disappeared into 600 meters of water. The disposal log, which is held now in the UK National Archives, notes the incident with bureaucratic brevity. Vessel U-2506, Type 21. Method, gunfire and depth charges. Duration, 47 minutes. Result, sunk. Remarks: hull remarkably resilient. Required 18 depth charges. This was Operation Deadlight, the Royal Navy's program to dispose of captured German U-boats in the months following the war. The operation ran from November of 45 through January of 46, and it involved sinking 116 submarines, 11 of which were Type 21s. The boats were towed out to deep water west of Ireland and northwest of Scotland, to areas where the ocean floor drops away to 600 meters or more, and they were destroyed by gunfire, by depth charges, by bombs, by whatever method was expedient. The goal wasn't to study the boats. The Allies had already selected the ones they wanted to preserve for technical analysis, but to eliminate them, to remove a potential hazard to navigation, and to ensure that the technology didn't fall into the hands of nations that the British and Americans didn't trust, which, in 1945, meant almost everyone. The decision about which boats to keep and which to sink was made by the Tripartite Naval Commission, a body established by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union to manage the distribution of captured German naval assets. The agreement, signed in the summer of 45, allocated 10 Type 21s to the Americans, 10 to the British, and 4 to the Soviets. The rest would be destroyed. That was the official plan. The reality, as it often is, was more complicated. The Soviets, who had occupied large sections of the German Baltic coast, raised several Type 21s from shallow water before the Tripartite Commission's inspectors arrived, and those boats never made it onto the official inventory. How many? The records don't agree. Soviet naval archives, declassified in the 90s, reference 8 boats. The Tripartite Commission's records list only 4 as officially transferred to the USSR. The discrepancy suggests that the Soviets kept at least 4 boats off the books, boats that would later inform the design of the Whiskey-class submarine, but that were never acknowledged in the formal accounting. But that's a story for another chapter. The boats selected for Operation Deadlight weren't necessarily the least valuable or the most damaged. They were, in many cases, simply the boats that were inconvenient to keep. Maintaining a submarine in peacetime is expensive. You need shore facilities, trained crews, spare parts, fuel. In November of 45, Britain was exhausted, financially and materially, and the last thing the Admiralty wanted was to spend money maintaining a fleet of German U-boats that had no strategic purpose. So they were disposed of, towed out to sea, and sunk. The photographs from Operation Deadlight, which are held in the Imperial War Museum archives, show the boats low in the water, battered and listing, while British sailors in peacoats watch from the decks of the destroyers. There's something almost ceremonial about the images, as if the sinkings were a ritual, a way of marking the end of the U-boat threat. But the ritual was hollow, because the threat had already ended months before, in May, when Germany surrendered. What Operation Deadlight actually represented was expedience. The boats were expensive to keep, and potentially destabilizing if they ended up in the wrong hands, so they were eliminated. Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Thistleton, the Royal Navy officer in charge of the deadlight disposal team, kept meticulous logs of each sinking. The logs are remarkably detailed, recording the method of destruction, the time required, the amount of ordnance expended, and any notable observations. Thistleton's log for U-2506, the boat that required 18 depth charges, notes that the Type 21's hull construction was significantly more robust than previous German designs, and that conventional anti-submarine weapons may be insufficient to ensure destruction in combat conditions. Which is an interesting observation to make while you're in the process of proving that those weapons are, in fact, insufficient. The Type 21 was designed to withstand depth charge attacks, to absorb punishment and keep fighting, and even in death it was hard to kill. The welded hull, the double hull construction, the reinforced pressure hull, all of that made the boat tough in ways that the earlier Type 7s and Type 9s weren't. And that toughness, ironically, made the Allies more afraid of it, more convinced that the design represented a significant advance in submarine technology. But here's the thing. Of the 121 Type 21s that were captured or surrendered, the Allies destroyed 96 of them. That's an 80% destruction rate. By comparison, only about 40% of captured Type 7 boats were destroyed. The rest were retained for training, for target practice, for technical evaluation. The Type 21 was treated differently. It was destroyed more systematically, more thoroughly. Why? One reason is political. The Type 21 was a symbol, the Nazi superweapon, and leaving them intact felt risky, felt like allowing the possibility that the myth might reassert itself. Better to sink them, to eliminate the physical evidence of the program, and to control the narrative about what the boats could and couldn't do. Another reason is practical. The Type 21s were complex, difficult to maintain, prone to mechanical failures. Keeping them operational would have required specialized knowledge, and in the chaos of the immediate post-war period, that knowledge was scattered, incomplete, held by German engineers who were being interrogated or recruited or imprisoned, depending on their perceived value. U-3008, Kapitän Leutnant Mansek's boat, was one of the 10 allocated to the United States. It was sailed across the Atlantic in the summer of '45, crewed by a mixed team of German submariners and American Navy personnel, and it arrived at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire in late July. The Americans put the boat through extensive trials, testing its speed, its endurance, its acoustic signature, its diving characteristics. The trials confirmed what the British had already concluded. The Type 21 was faster and quieter than any Allied submarine, and its design represented a genuine leap forward in underwater performance. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships issued a report, now held in the National Archives, recommending that future American submarine designs incorporate the hydrodynamic hull shape, the large battery capacity, and the snorkel system. That report became the foundation for the Guppy program, the retrofit initiative that modernized the U.S. submarine fleet in the late 40s and early 50s. U-3008 itself was used as a testbed for several years, and then, in 1949, it was scrapped. The official reason given was no longer useful. The real reason, suggested by declassified correspondence between the Bureau of Ships and the Chief of Naval Operations, was that the Americans had extracted everything they needed from the boat. They'd measured it, tested it, copied it. The hull itself was no longer valuable. So it was cut up for scrap, and the steel was melted down and repurposed. The knowledge, though, the knowledge remained. The last boat sunk as part of Operation Deadlight was U-2518, destroyed on the 2nd of January, 1946. The disposal log notes that the operation concluded with that sinking, and that all targeted vessels had been successfully eliminated. The log is signed by Thistleton, and there's a note at the bottom. End of program. Disposal complete. Which sounds final, definitive. But it wasn't complete. Not really. Because the boats that survived, the ones that the Americans and British and Soviets kept, studied, copied, those boats shaped the future of submarine warfare in ways that Thistleton couldn't have anticipated. Operation Deadlight eliminated most of the Type 21s, but it couldn't eliminate the idea of the Type 21. And in the end, the idea mattered more than the hulls. Chapter 14. The Soviet Whiskey. Stolen Thunder. Captain First Rank Anatoly Raspletin arrived in Gdynia in May of 1945 with orders to secure any naval assets that might be useful to the Soviet Union. Gdynia, a port city on the Baltic coast that had been occupied by German forces since 1939, was a major center for torpedo development and submarine testing, and Raspletin's team knew that there were Type 21s in the harbor, either scuttled or abandoned, waiting to be recovered. The challenge was finding them before the Tripartite Commission's inspectors arrived to catalog the captured materiel and enforce the distribution agreement. Raspletin had maybe a week, 10 days at most, to identify the boats, assess their condition, and arrange for them to be raised and towed east before the British and Americans showed up with their paperwork and their quotas. He worked fast. Raspletin's report, dated the 12th of June 45, is held now in the Russian State Naval Archive. It's a classified document, declassified in the early 90s as part of the post-Soviet opening of military records, and it's remarkably candid. Raspletin writes that his team located 4 Type 21 submarines in the Gdynia harbor area, all of them scuttled in shallow water, between 10 and 15 meters deep. The boats were in salvageable condition. The pressure holes were intact, the machinery was mostly undamaged, and the scuttling had been hasty, which meant that the Germans hadn't had time to thoroughly destroy the critical systems. Raspletin's assessment? This design is 10 years ahead of our fleet. That's a direct quote, and it's a striking admission from a Soviet naval officer in 1945, a time when the official line was that Soviet technology was equal or superior to anything the capitalist West could produce. But Raspletin was writing for his superiors, not for propaganda, and his job was to tell them the truth. The truth was that the Soviets had nothing like the Type 21. Their existing submarine fleet was built around pre-war designs, boats that were slow, noisy, and limited in their operational range. The Type 21 represented a qualitative leap, and Raspletin understood that capturing these boats intact could accelerate Soviet submarine development by years. The boats were raised over the summer of '45, a complex operation that involved divers sealing the hull breaches, pumping out the flooded compartments, and using floating cranes to lift the boats off the harbor floor. Once raised, the boats were towed to Leningrad, where the Soviet Navy's Central Design Bureau, TSKB-18, was based. TSKB-18 was responsible for all submarine design and development for the Soviet fleet, and in the fall of '45, they began a systematic reverse engineering effort. Every component of the Type 21 was disassembled, measured, analyzed, and documented. The hydrodynamic hull shape, the battery configuration, the snorkel system, the electric motors, the torpedo tubes, the control systems, everything. The goal wasn't to copy the Type 21 exactly. The Soviets didn't have the industrial capacity or the materials to replicate the German design wholesale, but to understand the principles behind it and adapt those principles to Soviet manufacturing capabilities. What emerged from that effort over the next 6 years was Project 613, the submarine that NATO would designate the Whiskey class. The first Whiskey-class boat was commissioned in 1951, and by 1958, the Soviet Navy had built 236 of them. 236. That's more than twice the number of Type 21s that Germany ever launched, and it made the Whiskey class the most numerous submarine class in history at that point. The boats were smaller than the Type 21, displacing 1,350 tons submerged compared to the Type 21's 1,621, and they were slower, maximum submerged speed of about 13 knots compared to 17.5. But they were simpler. The Soviets stripped out the complex hydraulic systems that had caused so many problems on the German boats and replaced them with manual controls. They simplified the battery charging system. They reduced the number of torpedoes the boat could carry. They made the design producible, manufacturable at scale using Soviet industrial methods. And it worked. The Whiskey class became the backbone of the Soviet submarine fleet for 3 decades, serving in roles from coastal defense to long-range patrol to covert operations. It was the Type 21's most successful descendant, not because it was better, but because it was real. There's a detail in Rasputin's report that I find myself thinking about. He notes that one of the boats recovered from Gdynia, designated U-2529 in the German records, doesn't appear in the Tripartite Commission's inventory. The Commission allocated 4 Type 21s to the Soviet Union: U-3035, U-3041, U-3515, and U-3041. But U-2529 isn't on that list, which suggests that Rasputin's team recovered it unofficially, that it was never reported to the Commission, that it was kept off the books. Where did it go? The records don't say. But the fact that the Soviets were willing to hide a captured submarine from their nominal allies tells you something about the level of trust, or lack thereof, in the immediate post-war period. The wartime alliance between the USSR and the Western powers was already fraying by the summer of '45, and technology transfer was a flashpoint. The Soviets wanted the Type 21 technology, and they weren't willing to wait for the Commission to allocate it officially. So they took it. And then they built a fleet around it. The Americans and British knew about the Whiskey class by the early '50s. Intelligence reports from that period, now declassified, describe Soviet submarines with streamlined hulls consistent with German Type 21 design principles. But they didn't realize the extent of the copying until 1956, when a Soviet submarine officer defected and provided detailed information about the design lineage. The CIA's assessment, documented in a report from that year, concluded that the West had underestimated the value of the Type 21 design, and that the Soviets did not make the same mistake, which is a polite way of saying that the Allies, in their rush to dispose of most of the captured Type 21s, had thrown away an opportunity to fully exploit the technology before their adversaries did. The Soviets, by contrast, had recognized the value immediately, had committed the resources to reverse engineer it properly, and had built a fleet that would dominate undersea warfare in the early Cold War. The Type 21 never won a battle for Germany, but it won the Cold War submarine race for the Soviet Union, at least in the first decade. That irony would have been lost on the German engineers who designed the boat, but it wouldn't have surprised them. Technology doesn't care about ideology. It goes wherever the resources and the willpower take it. Chapter 15. The American Guppy. Retrofit Envy. Rear Admiral Ruthven Libby wasn't an alarmist. He was a career Navy officer, deliberate and cautious, the sort of man who preferred data to speculation. But on the 14th of February 1946, he wrote a memo to the Chief of Naval Operations that bordered on panic. The memo, which is held now in the Naval Historical Center archives, summarized the trial results from U-3008, the Type 21 that had been captured intact and brought to Portsmouth for testing. Libby's assessment? Trial results are alarming. Submerged speed, 16 knots. Acoustic signature, minimal. If the Soviets replicate this, our anti-submarine warfare doctrine is obsolete. 16 knots. Most American submarines at the time could manage maybe 8 or 9 knots submerged, and even that only for short bursts before the batteries depleted. The idea that a submarine could sustain 16 knots for more than an hour, could outrun surface escorts and evade detection, was genuinely threatening. And Libby, who'd spent the war coordinating convoy defense in the Atlantic, understood what that meant. The U-boat threat, which had seemed definitively defeated in May of '45, could reassert itself in a new form if the Soviets, who were rapidly becoming the next strategic adversary, got their hands on this technology. And Libby assumed, correctly, that the Soviets already had. The U.S. Navy's response was the Guppy program. Guppy stood for Greater Underwater Propulsion Power, though the acronym was chosen more for its appeal, who doesn't like guppies, than for its descriptive accuracy. The program, launched in 1946 and running through the early '50s, aimed to retrofit existing American submarines with the design features that made the Type 21 so effective: a streamlined hull, increased battery capacity, a snorkel system, improved sonar. The first boat to undergo the conversion was USS Audax, a Gato-class submarine that had served in the Pacific during the war. The conversion, completed in 1947, was extensive. The hull was cut open, and sections were removed to reshape the exterior into a more hydrodynamic profile. The conning tower was streamlined. The deck gun was removed. No point having a gun if you're never going to surface. The battery capacity was doubled by installing additional cells in spaces that had previously been used for fuel or stores. And a snorkel system, based directly on the Type 21's design but with improvements to the valve mechanism, was installed. The result was a boat that could do 12 knots submerged. Not quite as fast as the Type 21, but fast enough to be tactically useful, and that could stay submerged for weeks at a time using the snorkel to recharge batteries. The official history of the Guppy program, published by the Navy in 1975, describes the initiative as inspired by the Type 21. Inspired by. That's a diplomatic phrasing, the kind of language you use when you want to acknowledge a debt without admitting that you copied someone else's homework. But Libby's private correspondence, declassified in 2003, is more blunt. In a memo to the Bureau of Ships dated March of 1947, Libby writes, "We are copying the German boat wholesale. The design is sound. Our task is to adapt it to our production methods and operational requirements." Copying wholesale. That's the reality. The Guppy conversions were an American version of the Type 21, built using existing hulls to save time and money, but incorporating all the key design principles that made the German boat revolutionary. The hydrodynamic hull, the large battery banks, the snorkel, the quiet electric motors. All of it came from the Type 21. All of it. 52 American submarines were converted under the Guppy program between 1947 and 1951, at a cost of about $1.2 million per boat. For comparison, building a new submarine from scratch at that time would have cost roughly $4 million. So the Guppy conversions were cost-effective, a way to modernize the fleet quickly and cheaply by adapting existing assets rather than starting from zero. But they were also a stopgap. The Navy knew, even as the conversions were underway, that the real future of submarine warfare was nuclear power. In 1954, USS Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine, was commissioned, and it rendered the entire Guppy program obsolete almost overnight. Nautilus could do better than 16 knots submerged. It could do 23 knots, sustained, for weeks, because it didn't rely on batteries. The nuclear reactor provided effectively unlimited underwater endurance. But Nautilus was built on the same hydrodynamic principles as the Type 21. The teardrop hull, the streamlined conning tower, the focus on submerged speed rather than surface speed. The design lineage is direct. The Type 21 never had nuclear power, but it established the template that nuclear submarines would follow. There's a technical detail that I find illuminating. The Guppy boats used Gould high-capacity battery cells, an American design that had been developed in the late 30s but hadn't been widely deployed until after the war. The Gould cells had about 20% more energy density than the lead-acid batteries used on the Type 21, and they lasted about 40% longer before needing replacement. That single improvement, switching from German-style lead-acid to American-style Gould cells, solved most of the battery reliability issues that had plagued the Type 21. The Germans had been working on similar technology. There are references in the archives to something called the Walter battery, an advanced design that was supposed to provide even higher energy density, but they never deployed it. The Walter battery remained a laboratory curiosity, a might have been. The Americans, by contrast, had the luxury of peacetime development, the resources to test and refine and perfect the technology before putting it to sea. And that made all the difference. U-3008 was tested for 3 years, from 1945 through 1948, and then it was scrapped. The official reason given was no longer useful for experimental purposes. But the timing is revealing. 1948 was the year the Guppy program was in full swing, the year the Navy had fully absorbed the lessons of the Type 21 and incorporated them into its own designs. U-3008 had served its purpose. The boat had been measured, tested, analyzed, copied. There was nothing left to learn from it. So it was cut up and the steel was sold for scrap. I asked a modern submarine engineer a few years ago what he thought about that decision. He laughed. "That's how you know they got what they needed," he said. "Once the prototype stops being useful, it becomes a liability. You don't keep it around for sentimental reasons." The Type 21 wasn't kept around, but its descendants are still in service. The Virginia-class submarines, the most advanced attack boats in the U.S. fleet, use a hull form that traces directly back to Gabler's drawings from 1943. The teardrop, the streamlined conning tower, the battery-powered propulsion. 70 years later, the design endures. Not because it won the war, because it worked. Chapter 16. The Wreck of U-2540, Resurrection. The salvage log for U-2540, dated the 1st of September 1957, is brief but precise. Hull located at 28 meters, Flensburg Fjord. Condition, remarkably intact. Pressure hull shows no significant corrosion. It is as if she were waiting for us. The author of that entry was Korvettenkapitän Hans Gunther Lang, the West German Navy officer in charge of the salvage operation. Lang was writing 12 years after U-2540 had been scuttled by its crew in May of '45. 12 years during which the boat had sat on the bottom of the fjord, undisturbed, slowly accumulating silt and rust, but otherwise intact. The decision to raise the boat was driven by a mix of historical interest and practical need. The West German Navy, reconstituted in the mid-50s as the Bundesmarine, needed training platforms and research vessels, and a Type 21, even one that had been underwater for more than a decade, was valuable for both purposes. The hull form, the machinery, the layout, all of it represented a baseline of submarine design that was still relevant in the late 50s, still worth studying. The salvage operation took 3 months. Divers descended to the wreck and sealed the hull breaches that had been opened during the scuttling, using prefabricated steel plates bolted over the seacocks and the ballast tank vents. Once the hull was sealed, pumps were used to expel the water from the interior compartments, and compressed air was injected into the ballast tanks to provide positive buoyancy. On the 3rd of September, U-2540 broke the surface for the first time since May of '45. Lang's report describes the moment in understated terms. Hull surfaced at 1400 hours. Structural integrity confirmed. Diesel engines seized but restorable. Electrical systems corroded but salvageable. Recommend full restoration for research purposes. The boat was towed to a shipyard in Kiel, where it underwent a complete refit. The diesel engines were disassembled, cleaned, and rebuilt. The electric motors were rewound. The corroded wiring was replaced. The battery banks, which were beyond salvage, were removed and replaced with modern equivalents, built by Siemens using 1950s technology. By 1960, U-2540 was seaworthy again, and it was recommissioned, not as a warship, but as a research vessel, renamed Wilhelm Bauer after a 19th-century German submarine pioneer. Wilhelm Bauer, formerly U-2540, served the Bundesmarine from 1960 through 1982. It conducted over 2,000 dives during that period, more than any Type 21 had managed during the war. The boat was used for crew training, for testing new sonar systems, for evaluating anti-submarine warfare tactics, for hydrodynamic research. And it worked. The pressure hull, which had been underwater for 12 years and then subjected to another 22 years of operational use, held up. The design was sound. The construction was robust. The boat proved, in peacetime, what it had never had the chance to prove in war, that the Type 21 was a functional, reliable submarine when it was properly maintained and operated by trained crews. The difference between 1945 and 1960 wasn't the technology. It was the context. In '45, the boats were being rushed into service with untrained crews, inadequate maintenance, and resource shortages that made reliable operation impossible. In '60, the boat had time for proper shakedown cruises, access to spare parts, and a crew that had been trained specifically to operate it. And under those conditions, it performed flawlessly. There's a detail in the West German Navy's public statements about the salvage that I find revealing. The official line was that Wilhelm Bauer was being raised for historical research and public education. Historical research. That was the cover story, the politically acceptable reason for spending government money to salvage a Nazi-era submarine. But the classified memos, declassified in the 1990s, tell a different story. The Bundesmarine was developing its own submarine program, the Type 205 class, and they needed data on hull hydrodynamics and battery performance. Wilhelm Bauer provided that data. The Type 205 boats, which entered service in the early 60s, have a hull profile that's almost identical to the Type 21. The teardrop shape, the streamlined conning tower, the emphasis on submerged performance. The design lineage is unmistakable. Wilhelm Bauer wasn't just a museum piece. It was a prototype, a testbed for the next generation of German submarines. The Type 21 lived again, not as a weapon, but as a blueprint. In 1972, Wilhelm Bauer participated in a NATO anti-submarine warfare exercise in the Baltic. The exercise pitted the boat against American destroyers and British frigates, modern ships equipped with advanced sonar and homing torpedoes. Wilhelm Bauer, a submarine designed in 1943, sank 2 American destroyers and 1 British frigate in simulated attacks. The exercise report, which is held in the NATO archives, notes, post-war submarines are still vulnerable to Type 21 tactics. Speed and acoustic stealth remain decisive advantages. 27 years after the end of World War II, the design remained relevant. The tactics remained effective. The Type 21, in the hands of a competent crew with functioning machinery, was still a threat. Not because it was a superweapon, because it was a good design. Wilhelm Bauer was decommissioned in 1982 and donated to the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven, where it's been a museum ship ever since. I visited it in 2003, walked through the interior, stood in the control room where the captain would have directed the boat during attacks. The space is cramped, claustrophobic, filled with valves and gauges and mechanical systems that seem almost primitive compared to modern submarines. But the design logic is still visible. The way the controls are laid out, the way the hull is shaped, the way the ballast system is configured. This is the ancestor. This is the boat that every modern submarine in some way descends from. And it's sitting in a museum in Bremerhaven, open to the public, a relic that's also a monument to the persistence of good engineering. The Type 21 failed as a weapon of the Third Reich, but it succeeded as an idea. And Wilhelm Bauer is the proof. Chapter 17. The Echo in the Deep, the Type 21's Shadow Fleet. I'm looking at a photograph from 2024, an image of USS Virginia, hull number SSN 774, one of the most advanced attack submarines in the United States Navy. The boat is surfaced, probably during trials, and what strikes me immediately is the hull shape. It's a teardrop, wide at the bow, tapering smoothly to the stern, optimized for submerged speed and hydrodynamic efficiency. The conning tower, they call it a sail now, but it's the same thing, is streamlined, faired into the hull to reduce drag. There's a snorkel mast, retractable, used for ventilation when the boat is at periscope depth. If you blur your vision slightly, if you ignore the scale and the surface details, it looks like U-2511. The lineage is unmistakable. The Type 21 never died, it just changed flags. The global spread of Type 21 design principles happened quickly, much faster than most technological diffusions in military history. By the early 1950s, every major naval power was building or planning submarines that incorporated the hydrodynamic hull, the large battery capacity, and the snorkel system. The Soviet Whiskey class, as we've discussed, was the first and most direct copy. The American Guppy conversions followed close behind. The British built the Porpoise class, diesel-electric submarines commissioned in the late 50s that used a teardrop hull and high-capacity batteries. The French built the Naval class, also in the 50s, with similar design features. The Germans, via the Bundesmarine, built the Type 205. The Swedes built the Hagen class. The Japanese built the Hayashio class. Every one of these designs traces back to the Type 21. Every one of them incorporates the lessons learned from studying the captured boats. The design became universal not because it was imposed by treaty or alliance, but because it worked. Because the physics of underwater propulsion are the same regardless of what flag you're flying. The transition from diesel-electric to nuclear power, which began with USS Nautilus in 1954, didn't change the fundamental design principles. If anything, it reinforced them. Nuclear submarines need to be optimized for submerged performance because they rarely surface. The teardrop hull, which the Type 21 pioneered, became even more important once you removed the constraint of battery endurance. Nautilus could go faster, could stay submerged longer, but it looked like a Type 21. So did the Soviet November class, the first Soviet nuclear submarine commissioned in 1958. So did the British Dreadnought class, commissioned in 1963. The nuclear reactor replaced the batteries, but the hull form remained. The Type 21's influence extended from diesel-electric boats in the 40s to nuclear boats in the 60s to modern attack submarines in the 21st century. The technology evolved, the design endured. There's a debate among naval historians about whether the Type 21 was innovative or evolutionary, whether it represented a genuine breakthrough or just a refinement of existing ideas. Some historians point out that the Dutch had experimented with streamlined hulls and snorkels before the war, that the Italians had used teardrop profiles in the 20s, that the concept of high-capacity batteries for extended submerged operations wasn't new. All of that is true, but what the Type 21 did, what made it significant, was integrate all of those ideas into a single functional design. Innovation isn't always about inventing something from scratch. Sometimes it's about combining existing technologies in a way that produces a qualitative leap in performance. The Type 21 did that. It took the streamlined hull, the large batteries, the snorkel, the advanced sonar, and it put them all together in a package that was faster, quieter, and more capable than any submarine that had come before. The individual components weren't revolutionary, the system was. I started this project thinking the Type 21 was a failure, a weapon that came too late, that didn't work properly, that had no impact on the outcome of the war. And all of that is true, as far as it goes. But the more I've dug into the archives, the more I've read the post-war intelligence assessments and the design histories and the technical analyses, the more I've come to see the Type 21 not as a failure, but as a blueprint. It failed as a weapon of the Third Reich. It succeeded as a design that shaped the next 50 years of submarine development. Every navy that captured a Type 21 studied it, copied it, adapted it. The Soviets built 236 Whiskey-class boats based on it. The Americans retrofitted 52 submarines to incorporate its features. The Germans resurrected one and used it for research. The British, the French, the Japanese, they all learned from it. The Type 21 didn't win battles, but it won the future. In 2009, a South Korean submarine designer gave a talk at a naval history conference, and someone in the audience asked him about the Type 21's influence on modern design. His answer, which was recorded and is now part of the conference proceedings, was revealing. He said, "We don't call it the Type 21 anymore. We just call it standard submarine architecture. That's how deeply it's embedded. The teardrop hull, the battery propulsion, the emphasis on submerged performance, those aren't features. They're the baseline. Every submarine design starts there and builds from it." Standard submarine architecture. The Type 21 isn't history, it's infrastructure. It's the foundation that every modern submarine is built on, whether the designers realize it or not. I've counted, using Jane's fighting ships and various naval technology publications, 47 active submarine classes globally that use teardrop hulls, snorkels, and high-capacity batteries. 47 classes, hundreds of individual boats. every one of them a descendant of the Type 21. If you measure success by replication, by influence, by longevity, then the Type 21 is the most successful submarine ever designed. It never sank a single enemy ship, but it defined how submarines would be built for the next 80 years. That's not failure. That's victory of a different kind. A slow victory, a quiet victory, but a victory nonetheless. The Type 21 didn't win the war. It won the peace, or at least it won the future of undersea warfare, and that future is still unfolding. The Virginia-class submarines, the Astute-class, the Yasin-class, they're all echoes. Echoes of a boat that was designed in desperation, built by slaves, crewed by men who knew it was too late. But the design was sound, and sound designs don't die. They evolve, they spread, they become standard. They become the architecture that everyone else builds on. The Type 21 is everywhere now. You just have to know how to look for it.